You are listening to the Doc Malik podcast. This show is 100% independent and fully funded by listeners like yourself. So, if you wish to support Ahmed in all that he is doing, then please subscribe to his channel on Spotify or his Substack. Or simply buy him a coffee with a one-off donation, links to which can be found at docmalik.com. Now, let's get on with the show.
Yes, we'll talk about that in a second. And so basically, I'm just slightly worried that you're a high-risk mumbler, and I want to make sure that we get everything clearly out. No, but listen, look, let's start now. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you for having me.
Dude, it's an honor and pleasure to have Escape Key in my fucking studio. I have loved your work, and it's just great that my audience gets to now hear you and not just read what you have to say.
Well, I much appreciate it. I hope I perform as expected. I don't know. Let's see.
Oh, yeah.
I haven't done a lot of these, basically, I will have to say, so let's see what happens.
You don't suffer from performance anxiety, do you?
No, not really. But you know how it is. Kind of basically, you say one thing and then, the brain sort of goes, nah, that's what you think.
Right. So listen, it's a bit weird because normally when I let my guest speak, I switch cameras, and we're not switching cameras today. My hand keeps wanting to go there to switch to camera one, which would then be you. But we've got the camera off you today because we're going to protect your anonymity. And it's sad that in today's world we have to do that, isn't it?
It's extremely sad. But it's one of those things at the beginning of, and I don't have to tell you about this basically, but at the beginning of the utterly fake pandemic, I was pretty much, there are only very few people in my industry who are on that side of the coin. Yeah, people didn't really take too kindly to it, so I just can't be bothered with it. It's just sort of.
You don't need that risk. You don't need that stress.
No, it's just essentially kind of what's, kind of throughout, since I started writing essentially in Substack, kind of I've sourced everything to the best possible extent that I could. And that generally involves using primary sources kind of for as much as I possibly can. And consequently, I receive a lot of messages sort of asking, so who are you and stuff like that. And it's like, why does that matter? What does it matter kind of if I'm from Mars? Surely kind of basically it's the argument which needs to sort of present its case and not me and my sort of attributes, so to speak. I mean, it's not the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah. I think there's two ways of looking at this. One, I think there's a lot of anonymous accounts I'm kind of suspicious of. They're suddenly blown up. They're very big and they almost run like a CIA outfit. There must be like 5 people in a room working on the content, like day and night. They're coming. Some people might argue that I'm quite prolific and I've got a MI6 team behind me, as you can see. They're sitting in the corner.
Hello.
Hi. The Mossad agent that you met in the garden. She's Mossad because she's hot as fuck.
Yeah.
And the MI6 guy, he's a bit of a dweeb. He's wearing a cardigan. And
You need to get a Russian, basically. The Russian agents during the Cold War were quite sort of, kind of basically pleasant on the eye as well.
All right. Are you listening? FSB? All right.
FSB is an interesting FSB, kind of that's Financial Stability Board.
Yeah. But listen, you've written so many articles, I can't keep up, right? But you've been doing some deep dives and trying to figure out how and why the world is working the way it is, global governance system or whatever. Can I just ask you to just dive in like the nuts and bolts? And some of it you get quite technical. It's a bit difficult to understand. I have to read your articles twice. Sometimes, like now when you came in, I was listening to the articles. You can do that on Substack. Just play the audio and listen and do other things while you're working around. But can you just tell me what you've unearthed?
Well, what I'm working on right now, which is not published as of yet, was ironically yesterday I sort of thought, well, this is a good place just to hang up my sort of coat for a little while, kind of basically. And what happens next is essentially I've just by chance read an article about Tony Blair becoming, the chief of this new Gaza sort of thing coming. And I started sort of thinking, well, hang on, we have the new sort of government template which has been rolled out in Ukraine. So sort of thought, I wonder if this template sort of aligns with Gaza, basically. And what a surprise. It's the same template again.
So I'm struggling to keep up. Sorry, what did you say?
It's basic, fundamental what they've done. They've constructed a template for, control. That's ultimately what it's about. It's about control. And it fundamentally works through economics or finance, conditional finance.
Conditional finance. And probably the easiest way to sort of understand it is basically central bank digital currencies will be programmable, or rather they will not be programmable, notch, right? Basically, which
effectively it just means that they put the programmability into the wallet, right? So you have a CBDC, it might not be programmable, the actual kind of CBDC unit, but the wallet will be. So it's the same thing. There's no difference, right? But the point basically with CBDCs here is essentially they become conditional, right? You have to clear some sort of gate. You have to sort of, it could be essentially you have to hit some sort of climate target or a health target or whatever, right? And if you don't clear that gate, you will not get a tranche of money, essentially like a quantity of money deposited to your account. And that's fundamentally the mechanism they operate with in Ukraine, where everything is conditional and where everything goes through sort of a digital government sort of procurement system, and they have digital ID, basically. I mean, the entire thing is digital through and through, and everything relies at the bottom level upon conditionality. So if you clear the condition, kind of that's fine, basically, then the transaction will go ahead. But if you do not clear kind of the transaction, you don't clear kind of your ethical imperative, right, relating to climate change or whatever, kind of, then the transaction will not go ahead, and consequently you will not receive that transferred money.
Okay, but the transfer of money, let's just stop for a second. You drink, clear your throat out a bit more. I feel like you've got a frog in your throat.
Oh, I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning. Kids,
So basically, that's if UBI's universal basic income, the government will say, look, you haven't got a job anymore. You guys doing everything. Here's some money, but it's going to be conditional. Like you said, you hit your health targets. You haven't had your flu shot. You haven't had your COVID booster. You're not getting this money. But what about people who have got jobs, who are working, who are self-employed or employed? Will they still have conditions that they have to meet before they get their money or their paycheck or whatever? How does that work?
It works both on. I haven't dived too much into this recipient side. The sort of it's more of a, so every single time basically you buy something down the supermarket or something along those lines, kind of you enter a transaction where there's a buyer and a seller, and for anyone kind of basically seeking to spend money out of the CBDC account, it's the wallet will have essentially that conditional sort of check on it.
They'll have a central what?
The CBDC sort of wallet, they will have a conditional check upon it.
Conditional check.
And because every single item you can buy in a shop will soon, the entire sort of data kind of from the entire supply chain will be available. So every single time you buy a pint of milk, they'll know where it's from. They will know kind of how much carbon dioxide allegedly was used in the production of this. So that means when you go down there and you buy basically kind of an item down in the supermarket, it might sort of say, no, you can't buy that because you don't have the carbon credits kind of in order to buy that pint of milk. Or you can buy this sort of, disgusting quasi milk substitute, with far lower sort of carbon sort of footprint. That's fundamentally how it'll work, right? That every single time you want to spend money, you will effectively have to clear a certain gate. You will have to sort of, be cleared basically by a clearinghouse, essentially, which is what I've spoken about a lot.
Okay, so this is completely dystopian. So basically, you're gonna be able, you're gonna be able to spend money, but only spend money according to what they want you to spend it on.
Correct.
Whether it's traveling or eating food, they're going to dictate to you. They're going to say to you, "Oh, you've hit the carbon target this month, so you can't eat meat anymore. You have to eat bug burgers or some shit like that."
Yes, basically. But the thing, this is a sort of point, right? Kind of basically because the CBDC is essentially the conditional built into the total transaction, kind of for the individual. So that means if you go down to the shop, kind of again, you try to spend your CBDCs, and it sort of says no, then it's basically kind of rejecting you on a personal basis. But the problem is essentially this is also being, in effect, this is already basically there for businesses because you got all the ESG and CSR goals. And a lot of people are sort of saying, oh no, but they're just like voluntary right now. Yeah, okay. But then you sort of start to talk about kind of basically what do you mean by voluntary, right? It's kind of, it is voluntary to want to spend more money kind of on interest payments, right? And essentially kind of if you don't clear a certain gate, a certain objective in regards to, your carbon offsetting or whatever, right? Then your borrowing effectively becomes more expensive. So yes, it is technically voluntary kind of basis, but I mean, it's just like saying like during COVID, like, taking the vaccine for healthcare workers is voluntary. It's like, if you don't want to feed your kids, you can totally not take it. I mean, it's completely absurd. It's mandatory kind of basically effectively. It's just sort of soft coercion as opposed to
hard.
Exactly. Yeah.
The ESG DEI is very nefarious and dangerous. And we'll come to that in a second, but let's go back to Gaza and Tony Blair, because we jumped a bit. So basically what you're saying is there's conditionality. People say, we will give you money, but you have to jump certain hoops. Now, when it came to Ukraine, you mentioned that. I'm surprised. I thought they just gave the money to Ukraine. I didn't know there were conditions attached.
Well, no, I've written about this quite a lot as of late, kind of basically I've wrote a couple of essays kind of on the situation you can. But fundamentally, everything kind of works on basis of conditional governance, kind of where they have to be, every transaction has to be basically audited and in a certain digital ID format, and it has to go through basically procurement sort of system, kind of where essentially they effectively have created sort of a grid where effectively kind of every single unit of it sort of strengthens every other unit of it. And it in effect means kind of basically in order for Ukraine to receive these tranches, they have to essentially play ball. If they don't play ball, kind of basically they won't get any money, and consequently kind of gets sort of game over.
But have they had to give away, for example, land, assets, companies, trading rights? I mean, what have they had to give up on?
But now you're talking about specifics. I'm talking more about basically individual mechanism, kind of where essentially Ukraine, kind of, I think it's only about a year ago, kind of basically signed an agreement with the European Union, because basically do realize kind of basically the pilot case here is Ukraine. That's the first example kind of this being rolled out. But it's essentially kind of the same framework which they're rolling out kind of basically in Gaza, kind of basically it's just earlier stage. It's not advanced to the same stage. Basically kind of, but I mean, I can run through kind of the sort of 6 rails kind of basically kind of that they effectively have.
Yeah, please do. I mean, because I'm really confused what Tony Blair's got to do with Gaza. I mean, if that's not a colonial mindset and quite fundamentally racist, why can't Gazans look after themselves and manage themselves? Why do you need a former prime minister who is a walking corpse as far as and a war criminal who led thousands of British soldiers to death, killed hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians in Iraq based on absolute garbage, and also, was there for COVID, pushing the jabs, pushing the lockdowns, pushing digital ID for the last 20 years, best friends with Larry Ellison going back 15, 20 years. He's got pictures with him shaking hands. Received £257 million by Larry Ellison in just the last 3-4 years. The head of Oracle, the second richest man in the world. And what is his Tony Blair Institute money doing with £257 million? If you ask me, that's not just a handout. That's a hey, I want a return on my investment. Something's going to be so. And Larry Ellison was in Trump's Oval Office on day 2 after his inauguration, right? Larry Ellison is best friends with Trump. He's visiting the White House. Larry Ellison is best friends with Tony Blair. And now Trump is wanting Blair to be in Gaza. It's like you got a little triad going on here, a little love triangle. What the hell is going on here?
Well, I mean, first off, kind of you're still operating on the idea that we're somehow under some kind of democracy.
No, I'm not.
Well, in that case, it makes more sense because the people who are appointed to these sort of jobs are the people who've done a spectacular job, according to kind of the very few at the very top, kind of basically the pyramid, so to speak, right? And if you talk about digital ID, yeah, kind of basically kind of in 2006 there was a national ID card which failed, obviously, but you had Claire, what's her name, Claire something, kind of basically since she went on and she worked with the World Bank and the CGD, and basically essentially then ID basically kind of got pushed out through that. Basically, kind of the what's called the Tony Blair sort of Institute. I mean, it's been about a year and a half kind of since I looked at them, but they're fundamentally in alignment with everything. But the point here is basically to go back to Ukraine, is that kind of it's not really about what you want. It's not about what other people want, because this is not democratic. This is about basically what the few people at the very top wants, and they can effectively enforce kind of basically through through gating money, essentially kind of you can effectively sort of control basically into your individual sort of transactions, which means you can't eat unless you agree.
Gating money, everything's conditional.
You're being cleared. I've spoken about kind of basic clearinghouse sort of quite a lot, and basically it was a fundamental structure which came out of London Bank clearinghouse in the sort of 1790s to 1860. Now, what that in effect did was basically since back in those days, you had those banks and you had a large amount of banks, and effectively they had a lot of problems because let's say kind of I was a customer, one bank, you're a customer with a different bank, and we wanted to exchange funds somehow. Now, if you have 1,000 different banks, it's going to lead to a system kind of base where everyone sort of goes over and exchanges, settles with everyone else, right? So what they came up with was essentially a system, which is basically a London Bank clearinghouse system, where effectively you had about 30 banks, which were sort of kind of like the equivalent of the sort of primary dealers really of the United States right now. And fundamentally what they did, these sort of clearinghouse banks would effectively net transactions with local banks. So you'd get essentially all local banks would operate with this clearinghouse bank, right? And then you get the entire sort of country kind of basically in this sort of hierarchy, right? And then basically kind of you have the final kind of all the clearinghouse banks, they would all net their transactions relative to one another, right? So this happened between 1790 and 1860, and it made the banking system hugely sort of efficient compared, right? No two ways about it, because it's far more efficient for 30 banks kind of to meet down the pub at the end of the day and just clear their transactions relative to one another, as opposed to, 3,000 banks kind of all have to settle relative to one another. But what happened in 1844 was essentially the Bank Charter Act. Up until then, there had been a number of different currencies. So that means effectively, if you live in Liverpool, you might have a Liverpool pound sterling, or not pound sterling, but Liverpool pound, whatever. And if you live in the Midlands, it's a different currency, yada, yada, right? In 1844, the Bank Charter Act basically was pushed through. And what that did was it granted the Bank of England a currency monopoly. So not from 1844, but I think from 1921, it was sort of a gradual sort of phasing in of the monopoly. But the point is essentially kind of, once you only have one organization, all the clearinghouse banks, the entire sort of hierarchy has to use your pound. You're effectively elevated to the sort of top status. And that's fundamentally kind of what happened. And that's basically kind of what, in effect, led to Bank of England basically being sort of, basically kind of in charge of the British banking system, so to speak. Because up until then, there'd been a number of different competing currencies, but basically, basically since those two things effectively placed the Bank of England basically right at the very top.
Okay, so if I was to be a devil's advocate, I would say, well, it kind of makes sense to have one place and one pound, but then centralization has never been good for anything. Secondly, the government the Bank of England, I keep looking into it and it says it's a government organization, it's government owned. Is it private or not?
I mean, look at a bit. See, there are some questions where effectively kind of you will never be able to answer them, basically, because kind of the evidence that you need is so far behind, luck, kind of away from, public sort of. Public.
But you understand what I mean?
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying. I know what you're saying. I know what you're saying.
On a superficial level,
the point I'm trying to say here is essentially kind of, it's one of those questions, right? Whether you'll have some people say this over here and some people over here will say this. Now, both of them make good arguments, right? Kind of basically, but the problem is essentially the critical evidence, which will determine kind of basically whether these people are right or those people are right, is not available. So you can keep running around in circles for a long time, as a lot of people do, and you will not be able to prove either, because essentially the evidence is just not out there. Right. So what you can do is...
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that, because I looked for it and I couldn't find it. So it's not that I'm not clever enough to find it. It genuinely isn't there.
No, I mean, see, the thing is essentially kind of, so they nationalized kind of basically the bank was in 1946, right? Kind of without going, I kind of want to go back to Ukraine here. Kind of go. Without going too much into it, basically, it's even that nationalization is a little bit sort of questionable in some regards. But anyway, kind of let's go back to Ukraine, right? Because essentially, and as I said, I wrote a sort of long sort of series kind of basically a while back, which is called Beyond the Law, which was fundamentally about like describing how kind of basically system they're building right now has got nothing to do with legislation or anything like that. It's not about democratic impulse or anything like that. It's about a system which is fundamentally built into technology, kind of getting steered by sort of committee, by expert panels, so to speak, kind of behind the scenes, right? And basically, fundamentally, how it works is essentially you have sort of 6 rails. Keep in mind, this is my reading, right? None of this is basically kind of public, but I can find documents to back all this sort of up. But there are no documents saying this is how it works, because obviously that would be pretty, not great kind of from that perspective. But it all aligns.
Because basically, what you're saying is they wouldn't expose their plans, their devious plans.
Yeah, exactly.
You've been able to find all the documents and piece it together, and you've come up with like how they're going about it.
You find essentially kind of, basically all the individual sort of bits of information. You find how it links to the next item, kind of basically, and you realize kind of basically this is actually part of a grid.
This is part of a what, sorry?
A grid. So, you have not just one component, but you have a number of components like pieces in a puzzle, and they snap in together. Kind of, they will tell you about the individual pieces, but they will not tell you that they're part of the same system. So, for instance, kind of basically the first rail kind of basically is into accreditation.
Slow down. Listen. Dude, slow down. Okay. Drink some water. This is too important. This is too freaking important. Your wife is right. You speak too fast. It's too important. Slow down. First rail.
Okay. So, yeah, as said, in Ukraine, they have effectively 6 rails, kind of basically is sort of my reading of the situation. And the first rail is the accreditation, which is effectively vetting. And what that does is that it vets who's allowed to buy and who's allowed to sell. And it's a fairly simple topic, kind of basically, essentially you need to run some sort of approval process in order to be allowed to sell and in order to buy. And then the second step is essentially kind of like finance itself. Finance will only be granted on the condition that essentially kind of that you adhere to the rules, that effectively you fulfill kind of basically a certain mandate, kind of, otherwise you will not receive finance. So that means effectively kind of, you will need to be accredited, and you will also need to basically be showing digital ID, which is essentially the third of the 6 rails, basically, kind of like that. There needs to be a digital spine throughout it all. And you're sort of your sort of part of the sort of digital sort of system is effectively your ID, because that's effectively your point in the system, right? And once you have the digital ID and you got the finance, which is conditional upon kind of basically your accreditation and the digital ID, then you have audits. So that means effectively kind of like once you've effectively received money and you've done whatever it was you had to do in order to receive that money, kind of basically then they can audit you basically to make sure that every single penny was spent in the way that you're sort of told them up front. And the next sort of item in that regard, now the sort of future economy doesn't really run on money alone, it runs on data, right? Who's got access to data is faster than everyone else and could hypothetically become an instant billionaire, right? So consequently, kind of access to data itself becomes the sort of lifeblood of the sort of new government's scheme, basically, so to speak, right? So for instance, kind of basically, we have the negotiations about PAPs, basically treaty. They have the pathogen access and benefit scheme, right? What that in effect is a set of rules where you basically sort of say, which essentially stipulate for you to get access to data, you have to fulfill certain criteria. And that means essentially kind of you need to have a surveillance system where you always share all your information, kind of basically with the wider community. So it's again a set of conditions for you to be able to access the data. If you don't fulfill the conditions, you will not get access to the data. It's that simple. So you see, again, kind of you're being locked in by the same system, right? And with that system, then again, basically locks into the rest of it, kind of basically, digital ID, yada, yada, yada. And the final thing is essentially kind of, so they have this system, right? Which effectively is defined basically by these other items. It still needs to be introduced to the people, right? And the way it's introduced to the people is effectively by public procurement. So that means every single time the state, or especially the United Nations, wants to enter into a partnership, basically, where it buys or sells or whatever, kind of, basically kind of all this will become conditional upon, all this entire sort of structure being placed. So that means essentially they're going to say, oh, it's against, it's anti-corruption, right? But what that in effect means is essentially that it's fully auditable, kind of against everything is completely traceable through basically supply chain, right? Now, once effectively they have a sort of process where effectively every single time you want to take advantage of the state wanting to buy something, right? The initial sort of demand is essentially kind of that you fulfill these criteria, right? But the next step down the line is essentially is that all the organizations which deal with you as well must also align kind of basically with the system.
Super insightful consultation, and Doc M came into it with an incredible amount of information and support. I really felt he was there to help, that he cared, and that he genuinely wants the best for you. Can't recommend him enough. Thanks again, Doc. From Dave. And folks, if you want to see 40 other reviews, 5-star reviews, just visit my website, docmalik.com, and you can look at in the menu consultations, or go directly to the booking page, docmalik.setmore.com. Book a consultation with me. If you're unsure about how to move forward with a diagnosis, with a treatment plan, or you feel like you're stuck in a rut, you don't trust your doctor, you've had surgeries and pills, and you've got side effects, whatever it might be, I can help you. I can act as your advocate. I can help you work the system to your benefit, knowing what questions to ask and to explore options that the mainstream doctors might not have covered with you. Folks, if this resonates with you, please book a consultation with me, and I can't wait to help you. Back to the show. Let's do the 6 things very quickly. Yeah. Accreditation, second.
Second is finance itself.
Finance itself.
Should probably be the final one. Kind of, it was just the order I thought of it.
3, 4.
Audits. That's once you've actually done, once you've actually purchased your order or done, fulfill kind of basically into the obligation, of the trade, kind of basically into, then you can be audited.
5.
Sure. Number 5 is basically kind of the data itself, the access to the data itself, which is a condition of you, generally speaking, being able to participate in the economy.
6.
So to speak. And the 6 is essentially kind of like that this is spread through public procurement. So that means essentially in order for you to participate in this system, as in you, for instance, if you want to sell wheels, Michelin wheels or whatever kind of tires to United Nations, you need to have implemented all these other rails. You must be inside this sort of digital sort of framework, so to speak, where they can trace every single penny, and they can effectively, cut off your access to your money under any circumstances, kind of basically if you've failed the sort of condition.
This sounds really dry and boring.
It is, and that's the reason why they do it this way.
It's just like layers of red tape, bureaucracy. It's like they're burying you under a ton of bureaucracy.
Yeah, but that's beautiful, isn't it? Because basically, what does that mean? That means essentially all the small enterprise can't follow suit, and that means kind of basically get rid of a lot of small businesses. Now, obviously, large enterprise basically enjoy this because first off, they get rid of kind of all the competitors, all the smaller competitors. But in addition to that, they also get access kind of to the United Nations and procurement and, obviously very, very beneficial deals for them, right? But what they don't really realize as part of this process is they still have to accept this system of essentially conditional finance, where effectively kind of basically the money they receive from United Nations kind of effectively be cut off, kind of basically if one of their suppliers kind of basically doesn't fulfill the criteria. So basically kind of everyone's really upset about large enterprise. Yeah, there's a lot of profiteering. I certainly don't disagree with that, but they're not the end boss, so to speak.
They're not the what?
They're not the end boss. If this was a computer game, kind of they would be sort of like kind of the second to final boss. Basically, they're not the end boss.
End boss.
Yeah, the end boss.
What do you mean by end boss?
I mean, like when you play a computer game, at the end of the game, you get the super strong guy that you have to beat, whatever,
Boss.
Yeah,
boss.
yes.
Boss.
Oh, sorry.
I think I meant boss. I'm like, what's a boss got to do with it? So they're not the end boss. No, of course they're not the end boss.
No, but the point essentially kind of is everything, all of this is conditional upon you fulfilling your ethical obligation, basically. It's
Who sets the ethical standard?
Well, that's a very good. That's a very good question. Well, basically, this is the thing. This is all about planetary stewardship, basically, because in order for you to be a good steward of planet Earth, you have to fulfill your ethical obligation. That means basically you cannot pollute the planet and all that sort of stuff, right? So you got climate change, biodiversity, breakdown, all these sort of planetary boundaries. Basically, it's all bollocks, right? But the point is that you have all these sort of alleged boundaries, and if you break any of these, then you're unethical. And then you can be censored, cut off from your benefits, whatever.
What I find really annoying is the very people who are creating all this, like people like Tony Blair and his institute, they're the evil bastards who create all the problem. They're the ones who fly around their private jets and their super yachts.
Yep.
They're the ones that force us to buy into consumerism and have little children mining in cobalt mines in Africa and dying. They're the ones raping the earth and the soil and pumping plastics in the sea. And then they accumulate wealth, resources, money, and then blame it on us.
Yeah, but I mean, look, Tony Blair has got a history. Kind of basically, he was a Marxist. Kind of basically when he was young, right?
Another Fabian.
I'm sorry.
Another Fabian.
Well, he's Fabian. Yes, he's another Fabian socialist. I like to call them parasites. It might be slightly inflammatory, kind of, but yeah, Fabian socialist.
I'll help you. They're fucking parasites.
Well, all right. Look? The point is, sort of the Fabian society kind of absolutely right in the center of this. Basically, kind of like they're sort of they don't disagree kind of with Marxism per se. They disagree with the way to get there.
Yeah. You know the difference is? I'll tell you for anyone who's
Well, it's
not.
ethical socialism. That's fundamentally what they are.
No, I think it's worse than that. So I think Marxism is like, this is what we are and let's do it overt and, this is what we need to do. And Fabianism is like their logo, wolf in sheep's clothing. Let's do it slowly and subversively. Gradually change society towards a Marxist socialist culture.
Yeah, but fundamentally, they agree on the end objective.
Of course they do.
I've written quite extensively, and I had to dig through some of their really old books, kind of sort of the history of the Fabian society and stuff like that.
Tell me a little bit of the history of Fabian society.
There's so many topics, kind of basically, which we already
Came out the UK, didn't it?
Yeah, it came out of United Kingdom basically in 1884. So you got one of my favorite sort of parts basically about the Fabian society quite early on was that it was only like in 86 or 87 that they decided they should read Karl Marx. They hadn't even read Karl Marx up until then, right? And that was basically when they sort of agreed, no, this is not really, we could not possibly do this in the UK. But I find it really interesting because some of the really early sort of books, basically, most of these people were basically champagne socialists, right? Because they weren't genuine sort of worker background or anything like that. They were basically middle class, and fundamentally they agreed with the principles of socialism, even if none of them really had any clear idea of what socialism was. And I find that a really sort of interesting sort of aspect, because essentially if they all agreed on socialism without really knowing what it was or agreeing on what it was, then kind of it could really only be for one reason: control. Yeah, control.
So the founding members included Sidney Webb, later Lord Passfield, economist and social reformer, Beatrice Webb, his wife, George Bernard Shaw,
Yes.
the playwright and critic, Graham Wallace, and some other middle-class reformers.
Okay, the thing is essentially, so the Fabian Society has got a very interesting sort of history, but there one particular path through history, kind of which I've spent quite a lot of time on, and that is essentially just to round off kind of basically Tony Blair, because we spoke about Tony Blair before. Kind of in 1991, Tony Blair wrote an article in Marxism Today. There's not a joke, in which he effectively said that he spoke for private-public partnerships, right, and they should operate for the common good. And basically, in the event they didn't sort of uphold the common good, it should be possible to sort of cut them off. That's fundamentally kind of what the article says.
Say that again. Go back. Slow down. Down.
Okay.
So he wrote an article in Marxism Today.
Yes, in 1991.
Promoting public-private partnership.
Yes, he said several things in this article, right? Kind of gets posted on the Third Way a while back, kind of on my Substack, right? Because I couldn't get a hold of the Third Way, the pamphlet, because Fabian Society pamphlets have got this nasty habit of going sort of, disappearing if they're particular bad, right? So fortunately, kind of I had a follower on Twitter, basically, kind of who sort of got me a copy of it, and I sort of reviewed it, the Third Way, and the sort of an interesting sort of input to that is really the 1991 article in Marxism Today by Tony Blair. I forget what it's called, but fundamentally he said two things, right? He said people should have their perspective sort of change. So instead of thinking about an individual as an individual, they should come to think of themselves as citizens. And the reason why is because basically a citizen implies that you're part of a society. And that effectively means that it's an implicit acceptance of some sort of external value structure, right? And what that in fact means is, obviously sort of socialist ideals that you have to adhere to whatever everyone else has to adhere to, right? And by that, I don't mean law. I mean basically sense of more of a sort of ethical quality. We all have to sort of behave in a certain way. But the primary thing it said basically kind of was that that public and private, that should basically be sort of reshaped to working together for sort of common objectives, right? Instead of being in feud with one another, they should work together to achieve the common good, basically. Now, and then obviously kind of your question, basically, where does that common good come from? And we can discuss that in a minute. But this is actually a really, really important sort of part of this, because basically kind of what Tony Blair in effect said in that 1991 article in Marxism Today was fundamental alignment with a book which was released in 1899 by a guy called Edward Bernstein. And what he effectively did, he operated kind of basically kind of on a book which was released in 1892, basically by a guy called Julius Wolff. We can get back to him in a bit. But basically, Edward Bernstein was a revisionist Marxist. And he basically said that kind of basically we need public-private partnerships kind of basically for the common good. And this was to work through cooperatives, sort of local cooperatives, kind of basically and basically after that came Arthur Penty of the Fabian Society in 1906. And he published a book or a report relating to guild socialism. And basically, what it effectively said basically kind of was, again, it was basically kind of local guilds should sort of learn to come together and essentially kind of operate kind of basically kind of from local perspective, as in, every stakeholder, so to speak, kind of basically at the local level, kind of for every decision or everything that needed to be carried out should come together, kind of basically and sketch out a plan. Right? Now, came after that basically, and I'm slightly accelerating here because there's quite a bit to go through here. Kind of G.D.H. Cole.
Slow down.
Okay. 1914, basically this chap, G.D.H. Cole, who was also part of the Fabian Society, he published more work on guild socialism, except he said basically now it's not. So for instance, basically kind of, if you had representatives from labor, right, labor unions, kind of basically now they should be national as opposed to local representations. So you see there's this sort of move from basically kind of having all the control at the local level, so now it needs to be national. And the next step after that came with Leonard S. Woolf in 1916. Leonard S. Woolf, he was the husband of Virginia Woolf. But anyway, in 1916 they published a report called International Government. And it was, when I read that report, it was probably one of the most important reports basically I've read, and I have read a lot of these dry reports because it's about 2/3 in. It's usually about 2/3 in that dig in, they have all these detail that they don't really want you to know. What that report in effect said was essentially we take the same model, right, kind of which G.D.H. Cole had scaled from local to national representation to international representation. But the point basically behind scaling to international representation is now you don't really have any governments basically which represents at international level. So if you have, say, for instance, a labor union, the International Labor Organization, ILO, then they sort of operate outside of kind of, sovereign capacity. And that was fundamentally the idea, because they would then have a postal union, and they would have like kind of basically a telecommunications union and all that sort of stuff. And all these different organizations would effectively kind of siphon off sovereignty basically from the individual nations, just a little bit at a time. Because basically, kind of, if you want to send a letter from here to, say, Sweden or whatever, right, there needs to be some sort of agreement in regards to what the rules are. Now, if you have an organization here doing it on behalf of all the governments, that organization will just siphon just a little bit of power off every single time it makes basically some resolution. Kind of basically, it'll just siphon a little bit of power.
Well, we can see that. Bank of International Settlements. Extra sovereign power sitting above anything, no jurisdiction from anyone. No one can look into it. Anyway, I looked up Edward Bernstein, 1850 to 1932.
Evolutionary socialism.
German Jewish socialist theorist and politician, one of the key figures in the Socialist Democratic Party of Germany.
Yep.
He was a close associate of Friedrich Engels and Marx. We know about those guys. Well, then he broke away from them, and then he is the founder of revisionist socialism. Pursuing Marx's revolutionary path, he argued for a gradual reformist approach.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the Fabianism. This is what I talked about.
It is.
So,
Rosa Luxemburg and the other sort of like kind of, revolutionaries basically mocked him as our German Fabian.
Basically. Yeah, his famous slogan was, the movement is everything. The final goal is nothing. His thinking ran parallel to Fabianism in Britain, which both emphasized gradual evolutionary change rather than violent revolution. And that's the problem that I have with the Fabians. Basically, at least with the Marxists, you know what you're getting. With the Fabians, they pretend to be good guys and nice guys when actually they're ending up with the same evil shit. I'd rather know who I'm dealing with and I know they're my enemy than someone pretend to be my friend and stab me behind my back.
Yeah, but it's far easier to stop those people, though. And that's sort of the point, isn't it? Basically, if they declare their intents up front.
Absolutely. Now, Leonard Woolf, 1880 to 1969, husband of the writer Virginia Woolf, British political theorist, publisher, and a member of the Fabian.
Are you fact-checking me?
No, I'm just repeating it. Member of the Fabian Society. But there was, like you said, his work, the international government. Just in case, also some people didn't miss what you were saying. Because dude, you speak fast. You got an accent. You got a frog in your throat, and then you were speaking super fast. So I'm slowing down a bit. And his work, that 1916 piece of work, written during the First World War, he argued for international peace requires formal institutions, rules, and arbitration mechanisms between states. He called for these international organizations to regulate disputes, enforce law, and his text was a precursor to the League of Nations and later to the United Nations.
I was getting to that.
Holy moly.
Yeah, this is the thing, right? But you missed a crucial aspect of this, because one thing is essentially Leonard S. Woolf's international government was said to siphon off sovereignty kind of from the individual nations, basically through these transnational organizations, international organizations. What you'd call an NGO these days, right? But the other thing was the way it would come about, right? Was essentially, so the quickest way for you to harmonize, two neighboring nations sort of policies, right, is effectively kind of basically by breaking down borders. And by breaking down borders, I mean essentially by having open migration, so people can just walk from one country to another and have no tariffs, because you've got no tariffs and you have basically open borders. So say, for instance, you have Sweden and Norway here, and Sweden kind of basically all of a sudden imposed drastic sort of taxation kind of basically on a particular type of activity. What's going to happen? I mean, it's just going to move to Norway. It's obvious, kind of basically, and by effectively making sure that there are no tariffs and people can just walk across the border, effectively you force neighboring nations kind of to synchronize, to harmonize their policies, their economic policies. Once they've harmonized their economic policies, you can start working on everything else. I mean, basically kind of the fundamental sort of aspect here is you break down kind of basically the borders economically, right? And once you do that, you can harmonize kind of economic legislation across borders. And what's really interesting here is essentially kind of is that every single time a nation comes begging for an IMF bailout, what do they demand? They demand open border policies. They demand any kind of protectionism to be, basically a thing of the past. And they demand basically kind of free tariffs, basically kind of. So effectively kind of the IMF, their essentially bailout sort of demands, their conditions. Let's use the right terminology here.
So a libertarian listening to this would be like, wow, we don't like borders anyway, and we don't, passports didn't exist 150 years ago. I should be able to travel anywhere in the world. I hate big government. I hate all of this garbage. isn't that perfectly fine to be able to just travel where you want and go to another country and set up shop and work? And at the end of the day, if you can provide for yourself, who cares?
I think it's a little bit of a straw man here, because basically, kind of hear what you're saying, and I don't fundamentally disagree, but basically it would fundamentally require you to accept kind of basically the sort of, sort of full sort of libertarian sort of premise, right? Whereas kind of basically the vast majority of libertarians that I speak to, and I consider myself a light libertarian, is that there needs to be some level of state. It's basically kind of, sort of what you're saying fundamentally is true, right? Kind of basically if you go by that logic, but only on the premise that you sort of say kind of basically, being a libertarian is a binary choice. And I don't think it is, basically, because, so that would effectively mean kind of you'd be an extremist either way,
Okay, so in terms of, the economic policy, the open borders and whatnot, so that's what they do. They just...
Yeah. But the thing is, so the IMF effectively breaks down borders basically by demanding kind of, the elimination of tariff-free trading and all that sort of stuff, and so any kind of protectionist sort of measures needs to be removed and all that sort of stuff. Now, it's really interesting what happened in the 1990s after basically sort of Iron Wall supposedly came down, right? Because basically what happened at that point in time, you had a number of hardcore sort of neoliberals, effectively, like, Paul Krugman, Larry Summers and all that sort of stuff, right? And they all promoted open borders, tariff-free trading. I mean, the lot, which again kind of is completely straight down the narrow, kind of basically of what Leonard sort of S. Wolf was talking about. And it's all been remarkably sort of straight down that line, kind of basically entire sort of way. But what's really interesting, so we go back kind of basically to the 1916 text, International Government, and you rightfully said that was used as a blueprint for the League of Nations in 1919. That was Alfred Simon, basically, kind of, and Alfred Simon also co-founded kind of basically Royal Institute of International Affairs, as in Chatham House. But what's more interesting right now, kind of basically in this context, is in 1926, he wrote a book called basically The Third British Empire. And that was basically sort of a project kind of basically with Lionel Curtis, who was speaking of Commonwealth at this point in time. Now, basically what they wanted to do was to get rid of the British Empire, effectively, right? So it's going to stay British in name, right? But it's not really British, right? The Third British Empire effectively should be restructured to be about international social justice. And it should be administered or controlled basically via economics. So right now you have effectively kind of basically the idea kind of basically of Edward Bernstein here, that you have the economic unit of accounts, basically kind of everything needs to be restructured, kind of, public-private partnerships for the common good. The common good is social justice. And the economy basically being restructured is the public and private public-private partnerships.
Okay, so just someone listening,
Yeah.
What's wrong with common good? So sounds nice. Public partnership, public-private partnership, working together for the common good, social justice.
Yeah, but who decides basically what the common good is? I mean, essentially, just because something is common good to you doesn't necessarily mean it's common good to me. Like, for instance, kind of, we could have long conversations here, kind of basically with people who are sort of strongly in favor, kind of basically of climate regulation and stuff like that. And I've gone through this history, in great detail, kind of basically, and I can tell you, kind of, global warming might be happening. It's completely impossible for us to calculate the quantity of material, kind of basically the amount of particles sort of sieving around kind of basically the world. And it's a fully sort of reflexive environment where waves, I mean, the lot kind of basically just pushing all this information continues around. It is completely impossible for us to even get close to modeling. And yet they're sitting saying kind of basically with certainty, oh, this is going to happen, right? But the point here is essentially kind of, what they in effect do is they establish a common good, basically, by having some sort of scientific modeling of something like the atmosphere. And then they say, oh, it's basically in all our interests, kind of basically become planetary stewards. And in order to become a planetary steward, we must not basically emit carbon dioxide, yada, yada. And the next stage after that, basically to tie it back into the conditional sort of finance base, which we open with, is effectively to tie that kind of basically economic unit account. So every single time you use your CBDC, then effectively kind of, if a transaction like buying a pint of milk takes you across kind of basically your threshold in regards to your carbon sort of credits count, then the transaction will not go ahead.
How much energy is required to run the data infrastructure, this whole digital infrastructure? How much energy is required to run this?
Oh, an enormous amount.
Because it must be tons. All the AI data centers, the storage, the computing power. I mean, the energy that must be needed to do this must be huge. Does anybody ever say, right, how much carbon is needed to do this? And what's the cost for this?
do you seriously think they care? I mean, look, kind of basically the same point in time while we destroy.
I'm playing devil's advocate.
No, I appreciate that. While we destroy our infrastructure, right? China built basically a coal plant every week, right? And for some strange reason, that's not a problem. But basically, but the more interesting question in this regard is, have you looked into the tiered mechanics of the provision of power, kind of basically for these data centers?
Sorry, say that again.
So basically, those areas where they build those large data centers, what they're negotiating is with the local power plants and that sort of thing is tiered access to electricity.
So they'll get first access.
Exactly.
Everyone else.
In the event there's shortages, their infrastructure is fine, and you're going to be living in darkness.
So, fucking hell. So I've been reading this Committee of 300.
Okay.
Have you read it yet?
Yes.
It's terrifying. I'm about halfway through. But basically, it lays it all out. It talks about the Royal Institute, the Chatham House. These are the committees. This is where all the power and decision making is made. All the decisions are made not in Parliament or Congress, but in boardrooms and in plain sight. And they tell us exactly what they're doing. And they decided in the 70s that they were going to deindustrialize the West. They decided in the 70s all the factories, all the heavy industries were all going to go out the window, and they were going to make the West poorer, colder, less energy, less food, and they're going to promote other places in the world like China. It's absolutely shocking. And it goes to show that these people are indeed not patriots, but globalists. They're parasites that go from one country to another. They're not loyal to any one nation.
No, I mean, look, there's quite a lot to sort of respond to there. Have you? So I've flicked through it now and then, kind of basically, but it's not. My side issue kind of with it is essentially kind of extraordinary claims require extraordinary sourcing, and in terms of sourcing, it's not there. Kind of basically, But I don't disagree necessarily kind of with what it says. I'm just saying if you're going to make those claims, then I want to see where you got it from.
But he talks about the Club of Rome, Dennis Meadows, limits of growth. They're all there. They've been talking about it.
I'm not disagreeing with what the book says. I'm just saying kind of basically I don't consider it a source because basically it doesn't say anything about where the material comes from. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's inaccurate. A large amount of that stuff kind of basically I've reconstructed myself. Generally speaking, I've taken the rather arduous sort of path kind of basically where I attempted to reproduce everything through sources. And yes, I've largely sort of agreed kind of basically with its sort of trajectory. But yeah, I just prefer sourcing because otherwise you get up against someone.
So what kind of sourcing do you get? You go to straight UN documents?
United Nations documents, Club of Rome reports, as said, basically Fabian Society reports, all that sort of stuff. But I mean, what you have to keep in mind basically regards to a lot of these reports is they hide everything behind a sort of wall of opaque terminology, basically a Soviet language, right?
Of course they do.
And the point is kind of like, in order to truly understand, you have to be able to sort of like read through what they really mean as opposed to what they say. And that does actually take a while. I mean, so in March 2024, I found this report called The Total Human Ecosystem, right? Kind of based by this guy, 7 And basically essentially it was really, really difficult to decipher it because it is like 5 or 6 pages, not long, but it's just a Sobian term after a Sobian term. And
Sobian?
Yeah, basically essentially, sort of opaque terminology where they say one thing, but it really means something else to insiders. But anyway, kind of so what this report effectively basically says, it sketches sort of the future of tomorrow, where humanity effectively is like any other caged animal, so to speak. So basically the idea becomes humanity as a species, and being managed as a species, as opposed to being autonomous sort of agents, so to speak. And it's if you then go back to...
So basically, while you're drinking your water, what you're politely saying is what we already know. They look at us as cattle.
Oh, yeah.
And it's about how do we manage the cattle? How do we manage this herd? I mean, they even say it, herd immunity. Like, what the fuck? Like, herd immunity.
Have you read the 29 Berlin Principles report?
No.
See if you can find it. It's on one of the university's sort of sites, right? And basically what it says that, we've learned to realize something along the lines of it prefixes this by saying this is a one health ethical approach, right? So it's an ethical approach. And it says that we cannot treat human health as separate from the other animals. I mean, that is literally what it says. If nothing else, go on my Substack, and search for Berlin Principles, and you can find it there.
Yeah, you're right. It's on the oneworldhealth.wcs.org website about the 2019 Berlin Principles on One Health.
Yeah, no, but in fairness, kind of basic. So that's just the principles themselves. I should really be more specific. Kind of like there's an article, full article where they're being introduced.
Oh, the Berlin. I've found it. El Silvier. Yeah, I've got it now.
I think it's section 4. Kind of basically, it's got a section kind of basically regards to One Health ethics, and it says, basically, you cannot treat human health as separate from that of the other animals. I mean, that should tell you everything you need to know.
That's kind of worrying.
Yeah, but so if we go back to 1968, there was basically a conference, UNESCO conferences, very frequent.
Joined up ethics of One Health provides an opportunity to promote justice and solidarity where humans, other animals, and the environment meet.
All right, well, let me just find this basically because it's definitely there.
I agree. I'm just saying, I'm sure it's there, but it's just...
Yeah, let me just find this. Because it's one of the most outrageous things. I find it quite astonishing. Kind of basically, they could have written this, but anyway. All right, so basically it says ethical foundations. Underpinning the Berlin Principles is a broad One Health ethical framework that aims to foster the health of humans, animals, and their shared environment, blah, blah, blah. The current entwined emergencies of public health, biodiversity loss, and climate change clearly illustrate the impossibility of protecting human health in isolation from the health of the other animals. That's what it says. I've got the quote here. Kind of basically, it's it's quite literally what they say.
Technically, we are an animal.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. But do you want to be managed like one?
No. Is this what it all comes down to? Is it all about just the people who have the power and the money want to basically control all of us like cattle? And
I think
there's a drive towards a one world government, isn't it? One world governance.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a misguided sort of idea that they know better, right? Which is sort of,
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that's what they want, though. They
yeah,
think...
no. But I'm trying to sort of like justify it, basically quasi justify it from their perspective. I mean, it's completely lopsided, of course, kind of basically, but because they sort of fabricate this sort of scenario where planetary boundaries. I mean, have you ever looked at planetary boundaries? Okay, so basically, so they had 3 years, right? They sampled in 2009, 2015, and 2023, I think it was, right? And it's on their own website, right? And one of the boundaries, basically, they haven't yet determined. It's indeterminate, right? However, they show that it's already outside the carrying capacity, right? And in 2022, that was still outside the carrying capacity. It hadn't really changed, but now they knew what it was. It's completely absurd.
Sorry, I don't understand. What does that mean?
It means that basically in 2015, they could tell you that something was outside of the planetary boundaries, but they could not tell you what it was.
Planetary boundaries in what respect?
In planetary boundaries, is regards to carbon dioxide or biodiversity or yada yada yada. It's also sorts of boundaries which we supposedly can't cross or will cause irreparable damage.
Oh, so they've put these arbitrary boundaries up. They've set
Yes.
these limits and said, oh, you can't cross it, otherwise something horrible will happen.
Yeah, but basically the point here is that they originally knew, I think it was 5 of them, basically 4 of them, and then they knew 6 of them, and now I think they know 8 of them or something along those lines.
No, 8 of what?
These boundaries. So one of them is still outstanding. They haven't determined what it is yet. But I mean, the ludicrousness of it is that in 2015, they knew that one of the boundaries was outside essentially threshold. So we're already exceeding the boundary of this, but they couldn't tell you what it was. And in 2023, suddenly they fill in, oh, it's this. I think it's on, as far as I recall, if you just type in planetary boundaries, go on their websites, basically, is one of the first graphs they got there.
StockholmResilience.org? Is that the one?
Yeah. So basically, they'll have these right here.
All right, I find it, yeah.
Yeah. Can you zoom in, based on 2015?
Okay, I've got it now.
Yeah, novel entities not yet quantified. You can see it's clearly outside basically acceptable threshold.
All right, hold on a second. Let me just, hold on a sec. So I've got it. Planetary boundaries. I'm still not understanding what planetary boundaries are.
It's how much carbon dioxide we can emit and how much biodiversity, how many trees we can chop down.
As the framework highlights the rising risk from human pressure on 9 critical global processes that regulate the stability and resilience of the Earth. In 2023, a team of scientists quantified for the first time the framework's 9 processes that together maintain a stable and resilient Earth. All right, well, good for them.
Yeah.
And then if we zoom into 2009.
2015. No, go to 2015.
All right, 2015.
And top right, you'll see novel entities and it's grayed out.
Not yet
quantified.
Yeah, so, and there's also B2, not yet quantified. Atmospheric aerosol loading, not yet quantified.
No, but the point here is, since the novel entities, they were not yet quantified, but they are certain there is already beyond the thresholds.
Yeah.
And then in 2023, oh yeah, it's definitely not about the thresholds, but now we know.
Yeah, that doesn't even make sense.
No, exactly. Kind of, they had the numbers before. Kind of, they even knew what it was about. It's total bollocks.
They're just making it fit their graphs and their charts,
Exactly.
aren't they?
But yeah, no, they are basically. But think about this, right? If you speak about game B, right, basically into that environment, right, you often come up against basically the meta crisis, right?
What crisis?
The meta crisis.
Meta
Crisis. It's not just
meta
crisis.
meta crisis.
Okay, fine. Meta crisis. So basically, kind of what the meta crisis is effectively planetary boundaries.
Okay.
So basically, if you have all of a sudden not one boundary breaking, or two boundaries or three boundaries, then you have simultaneous sort of boundaries basically being crossed, and consequently you have a basically crisis on multiple fronts. And consequently, we need a framework which can deal with the meta crisis. Clever, isn't it?
Very, very clever.
Yeah, too clever.
Too clever.
And then, of course, you have got the same thing, kind of basically. I mean, you also have the same in regards to sort of social indicators and stuff like that.
All right. Okay. Right. Let's just zoom back out for a second. So the evil, bad people, bankers, or even above them,
Central bankers.
central bankers.
Yeah.
But the only central bank that I know of that's private is the Federal Reserve, and out of the Federal Reserve is the New York Federal Reserve mainly.
Okay, but this is what I said earlier. I tend not to try spending much time on things which you will not be able to answer. Like, for instance, basically, we have the conversation about gain of function, right? For instance, basically, that's been going on for 5 years now, and I still see people arguing just as passionately about it. What has that resolved? One of the things I realized from a professional career some years ago is that there are certain topics which are just sort of black holes of time, basically, and those things you will never be able to answer. So everyone will agree.
So
consequently, what you have to do is you have to circumvent them.
So how do we even know it's bankers?
Because everything ultimately comes back basically, it's the London Bank clearinghouse mechanism. This is fundamentally the mechanism that they shift into everything. It's basically see, the thing is, we never really got to this basically, but what the London Bank sort of clearinghouse sort of structure basically in effect does, where you have all the local banks down the bottom of the hierarchy, then you have the clearinghouse banks, or the primary dealers, basically in American sort of terminology, and you have the Bank of England at the very top, or the Federal Reserve of the United States. That entire structure is essentially also it's hugely efficient. Of course, it's very efficient, but fundamentally the organization which is on top, or even the clearinghouse basically structures, they can refuse to clear the banks below them. So that in effect means basically if the Bank of England were to cut out one of the clearinghouse banks, they would go bankrupt almost immediately, because how are they even going to sort of basically do business if they're not part of the same network? It's basically what they do with SWIFT, with regards to Russia. They cut them off from all the sort of international sort of monetary exchange sort of mechanisms, so to speak, but fundamentally the clearinghouse structure, which is efficient, but the efficiency comes at the cost of effectively granting someone power who's sitting at the apex basically of that structure. And whoever's sitting at that apex is effectively an expert panel, so to speak. It's a small group of people basically who are sitting dictating basically whether a transaction will go forward or not. And that again basically comes back to essentially central bank digital currencies, where effectively if you go across your threshold, then you cannot buy the pint of milk, or it'll go to basically Ukraine, where Ukraine will not get the next tranche of conditional aid unless they build basically next generation digital ID systems, which incidentally they have. It's all very highly organized. And I said originally, basically I can see the same thing happening in Gaza.
And is this all just organic? This is just what happens with bureaucracy, and the system just does this? Or do you think there's a guiding hand behind it, and there's people and individuals that are, what's happening?
There's no way this is organic, right? And Steve,
folks, as you know, I've got no sponsors for the show, so no one pays me money to place ads. I do have an affiliate page, a shop page. So if you visit my website, docmalik.com, you'll see there's a shop page, and you can look at Hunter Gather. They do great food. We've been using them for years before even I started the podcast, and there's a little code you can use there. And there's a lovely sauna company, Wellness Hercules, that has an affiliate code with me. They have brilliant saunas and cold plunges. I highly recommend you visit my page and have a look at that. And there'll be some other ones as well, like sea green supplements with iodine and micronutrients. Like I said, they don't sponsor me, but if you buy from them, I do get a little tiny percentage, and it will go a long way to supporting the show. Folks, I also want to say thanks to all of you who've been leaving reviews on Spotify, the 5-star reviews. I've seen that they've gone up. I can't thank you enough. And also on Apple Podcasts. And on that note, I just want to say thanks to Antonia Eastwood, who wrote the following comment. Entertaining and informative, 5 stars. I look forward to Doc Malik's podcast very much. He has a very good, easy to listen to style with informative, insightful, and interesting guests that will help you beat the system. I don't think there's been one episode where I haven't been entertained or informed. Thank you, Antonia, and thank you everyone else who's leaving reviews and sharing my content. It makes a difference. Okay, folks, back to the podcast, and thank you so much.
So,
because I hear this, people say it's systems. It's the systems.
When you go through this sort of history, kind of, it's too perfect, it's too immaculate for it not to be basically by intent. So in 1992, so for instance, carbon pricing, right? Basically in 1975, we didn't know anything about basically whether carbon was good for the environment or what ultimately kind of basically would be the result. Actually, let's go back to sort of 1971, where Richard A. Falk wrote a book called Our Endangered Planet, I think it was called. And he basically sort of put up 4 potentially sort of vectors of control, basically, kind of the future world order, right? Kind of basically, he was part of an organization or a group called basically the World Orders Models Project. And he was basically going through 4 different potential control mechanisms. The 4th of them basically kind of was environmentalism, basically. Kind of, and he said in that 4th chapter, basically saying, there's a side issue here, kind of basically it might not be as strong a sort of topic, kind of basically people might not buy into it ultimately. It might not be sufficiently scary kind of basically for people to buy into. So in other words, kind of basically he's effectively saying, okay, we might be able to use environmentalism in order to drive this, but I'm not personally convinced that it's strong enough, a strong enough argument. And then when you look at essentially what took place in the 70s in regards to kind of the carbon narrative, I mean, it's just a mockery of science. In 1975, IIASA, they published the first sort of serious sort of report on carbon pricing. This is at a point in time basically where no one knows kind of basically if it's, causes temperatures to go up or down. There's no indicator kind of based from the average sort of temperatures. And as a matter of fact, a couple of senior NOAA scientists had said in, I think it was Newsweek or Life article, kind of basically that they thought that temperatures were going global cooling, right? I mean, these were not cranks. These were senior scientists kind of with the NOAA, right? And then in 1975, we also have the Belgrade Charter. And what the Belgrade Charter was, it was a UNESCO charter, basically, which said that we need to fuse environment into education and we need to prepare for a global ethic, which is obviously about planetary stewardship. Now, the reason why that's really interesting, right, is because in 1976, Bert Bolin, basically, who was the major sort of guy in regards to climate science in the 70s and 80s, he went in front of kind of US Congress, basically, and he said, we practically don't know anything. Kind of basically, we know it's plant food, but personally, I'm worried about rising carbon dioxide. He basically stood there and said, we don't know anything, right? Then you can go basically essentially to 1977 and the 1977 Clear Act amendments, basically United States. They introduced carbon offsetting kind of as a mechanism where, you sell allowances to emit basically essentially new, sources and sinks, so you can cancel them out, right? So kind of basically in 1978, basically the IIASA kind of had a working group which effectively established that they knew less about the global carbon cycle that they thought they did a decade ago. In other words, they said, we don't fundamentally know anything, but they felt that temperatures would probably rise by 2 degrees, which is just absurd. They're sitting saying we don't really know anything, and they had no data on oceans, practically no data on oceans at all, which is by far the largest part of the global carbon cycle. And this was in summer 1978. In 1979, basically at the first World Climate Conference in February 1979, the ICSU, International Council of Scientific Unions, basically they neglected to invite anyone who disagreed with this, but they fundamentally got a bunch of scientists together who expressed grave concern and effectively established a sort of implicit carbon consensus. That took place in 1979 at a point in time where there was no data suggesting it. And just a few months after, the IIASA, in their own internal working groups, had said, we don't know anything. It's just this story again and again and again of these absurd things, right? But then basically kind of, you can forward a little bit, in the 80s, and kind of basically then get kind of to IPCC, basically. Bert Bolin also was a major influencer behind kind of, and In 1988, as the IPCC had been established, do you know what the New York Times reported?
Is that interplanetary climate change?
Yeah, the New York Times in 1988 announced that global climate change has arrived. Oh, what a coincidence! Kind of basically, IPCC had just come into being, and then in 1990, in Working Group 3, IPCC Working Group 3, they talk about kind of carbon offsetting and how to trade it. But before that even happens, in 1985, we had all the ozone sort of stuff.
That's all disappeared.
Yeah, well, this is the thing, right? In 1985, there was all this talk about the ozone layer, right? In 1987, we had the Montreal Protocol. What the Montreal Protocol was that it established language not for trading, but for swapping kind of emission permits. So that means if one state couldn't use all the emission permits, you could just send them over to another state and they could use them. There was no mention of essentially trading or anything like that. But in 1990, basically Working Group 3 of the IPCC then started detail in depth kind of basically regards to how this system would work. And in 1992, basically the UNCTAD kind of reported the first of two reports called Combating Global Warming, which again, I was very privileged to find not one, but two people on Twitter. That was back in the days where I was still on Twitter. Basically kind of like two people sent me those reports. They're impossible to find, right? And what those two reports in effect create is they outline a complete system, almost perfect system for the future kind of basically of carbon trading. And the reason kind of basically regards to you said before, kind of like, oh, couldn't this just be a coincidence? Well, okay. One of the contributors to that was Michael Grubb. Michael Grubb was basically kind of part of the Royal Industry of International Chatham House, sorry. And basically, he did a lot of the early work in regards to kind of basically carbon trading kind of for Chatham House. And in 1992, that report, Combating Global Warming, kind of essentially establishes the framework, the early framework of it, right? And do you know how the report ends? It ends by saying kind of that in the future, kind of basically kind of, essentially air and water will be basically traded commodities as well. Now, that report has got a sequel from 1994, right? And I forget what his name was, basically kind of, but one of the key contributors kind of to it, basically kind of essentially in 1993, quit his job with, I think it was Goldman Sachs, in order to create kind of an organization which traded basically essentially kind of carbon and sodium dioxide, I think, kind of, trading, right? And then he goes on to write the report on how this system should work. I mean, essentially, it seems like such a gross conflict of interest that originally he basically wrote the rules kind of based regards to sodium dioxide. Then he splits out kind of based from Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan or whatever to set up his own sort of outfit kind of basically. And then the next thing that happens is he writes the international rules for this. I just don't understand.
Who's that again?
I can find out.
So can I quickly tell you about something? So like there's a guy called Al Gore. He did that documentary, The Inconvenient Truth or something.
Yes. So
he founded the Generation Investment Management in 2004, headquartered in London, and the business was meant to be sustainable investment fund and integrating environmental, social and governance factors into asset management. And part of it was the carbon trading business. They heavily invested in companies that were positioning to benefit from carbon markets. And at one point, GIM's assets under management exceeded 30 billion. And then Gore and GIM were early backers of the Chicago Climate Exchange, the first voluntary carbon credit trading market in the US, founded in 2003, but it collapsed in 2010 after the US Congress failed to pass cap and trade legislation. But his company still profited. Then in 2007, Gore became a partner at KPCB, again, another Silicon Valley venture capital firm. Basically, he's made tons of money promoting all this.
Read what's basically highlighted in red and yellow.
Okay, so here we go. All right, here we go. So, air and water are simply no longer the free goods, inverted comma, that economists once assumed. They must be redefined as property rights so that they can be efficiently allocated. It is self-evident that the allocation of these scarce but vitally important resources will be a major problem of the 21st century and beyond. Population growth and further industrialization of the planet assure this. These simple facts make it essential for research to continue as rapidly as possible so that we can implement market solutions to the highly critical environmental problems facing us. Fucking hell, they want us to pay for the air and the water that we use and drink.
That was in Combating Global Warming from 1992. And that's a United Nations document.
These people are sick.
Yeah. Well,
So again, I'm going to come back to it. Are these just well-intentioned but ignorant middle management bureaucrats who bought into the ideology? Or is there nefarious people behind who create this bullshit pseudoscience, get a whole class of middle management bought into it, who get paid salaries and careers and research and everything? The money's there, and then they execute it.
yeah, but there are a couple of issues basically come with that explanation. Basically, so I've worked in R&D for quite a few years of my career, right? And basically, kind of when you do R&D, you fundamentally, it's very much sort of like kind of take one step forward and take one step backwards. Kind of sometimes things work out, sometimes basically things sort of pan out, kind of basically, and everyone's happy. But generally speaking, kind of there's a lot of failure, right? Kind of because you're effectively taking a risk. You have an idea, kind of basically try to sort of develop it, and it might not pay off. It very frequently doesn't pay off. So these reports, for instance, a lot of these reports are completely brand new, kind of basically as in there's not really any predecessors for them. So these two combating global warming, for instance, kind of basically are completely brand new.
Completely brand new.
Completely brand new, right? Now, in a situation where essentially this is completely brand new, supposedly, right, you would expect there to be sort of, sort of errata or basically slightly polished sort of perspectives. Like for instance, kind of basically on Substack, kind of basically, since my understanding gradually sort of hones in on supposedly truth, whatever, right? Kind of basically, that doesn't necessarily mean you're incorrect when you start off, but it's just essentially just like it's not a full understanding if you know what I mean.
Fine tuning it.
You're fine tuning it. Exactly. Basically, if this was proper R&D, they would be fine tuning it, but they're not. They're not fine tuning it. They're just stating it, and the next report they release is just building completely perfectly on basis of the previous reports. That's not R&D. That's basically a situation where everything's written up front. And that's complete bollocks, kind of essentially, kind of, so you say, but whether essentially it could just be basically kind of sort of a coincidence. There are so many coincidences. It's just one coincidence after another. Right? So in 1930, kind of basically when the Bank for International Settlements was founded, it was founded kind of basically kind of effectively using a gold clearance receipt sort of function, which fundamentally was based upon a book called, it's German, kind of based by a guy called Julius Wolff, which was written in 1892, right? In 1892, this chap, Julius Wolff, sort of suggested this is how kind of gold clearing should work. Kind of basically, the Bank for International Settlements in 1930 used that mechanism. At that point in time, everyone was committed to a gold standard. In 1931, Chatham House started basically writing they wrote a report saying the problem with the gold standard. Within a few months, the Bank of England stepped off, kind of basically, stepped off sort of, basically gold standard. In 1933 and 1935, the Chatham House basically continued writing more reports based in regards to fiscal policy and monetary policy and harmonizing basically the two of them. What they were in effect doing was essentially they were doing really early work for what you'd consider quantitative easing these days, right? But they're also basically preparing for the 1936 Keynes, a general theory, right? He released essentially his theory kind of basically in 1936, basically a general theory. And effectively, it's all about kind of basically running countercyclical sort of spending, right? So in good times, you kind of you save up kind of for the bad times, which is good enough kind of basically kind of if it's your personal household, right? Of course, it works fine based for the personal household. But in terms of politics, this is never going to work because any government which will save up during the good years will immediately basically be voted out.
Yeah, but also, look, a couple of things there. So again, reading this book, The Committee 300, it's clear that Chatham House is one of these policy think tanks which actually creates the plans, creates the vision, and then delegates it to other people like the Bilderberg Group or the Council for Foreign Relations or the Trilateral Commission or the Fabians. Like, it's one of the incubators for the ideas about what it wants to do.
Basically, the primary think tank, so effectively Chatham House, basically in the Council on Foreign Relations.
And that's just the American outshot. But what I'm saying is they come up with the policies and everyone else then executes it. But like even Keynes, like initially he wrote something about money creation and he got the attention of the you-know-who. And then he stopped talking about money creation. Then it was all about boom, bust and saving and deposits. But he omitted to mention the money creation. And Richard Werner talks about this, economist. And it's interesting. I think Keynes became a director at the Bank of England. And to become a director, you need to have significant shareholders. I mean, so basically they stuffed him with money and he pushed out this Keynesian economics, which is just BS because it doesn't factor in money debt creation.
I don't necessarily agree with any of that, right? Kind of basically, I haven't read up to basically that extent, those basic aspects. But what I can say is essentially kind of Keynes's general theory is enabled by basically the groundwork basically of the Chatham House, basically kind of leading up to 1936. And basically the other sort of interesting aspect is essentially Leonard S. Wolfe, which we spoke about earlier, basically in regards to international government. Keynes were part basically essentially of the Cambridge Apostles, which is one of those elite secret society groups. In 1930...
Cambridge Apostles?
Yeah.
Never heard of them.
No, there's a reason for that. I wrote a Substack article about that. But anyway, in 1930... Victor Rothschild was basically under question in the 1970s, basically for...
Victor who?
Victor Rothschild.
Victor Rothschild.
Yeah, basically kind of in the 1970s, basically was being questioned whether he was a spy, right? And now...
So was he in the UK?
Yeah, he was in the UK. He was basically part of the MI6 kind of during the World War II.
So who was he being a spy for?
Soviet Union.
Was he?
Well, this is the thing, kind of, isn't it? Obviously, they protest their innocence, basically, but there's a lot of dubious sort of things here.
Okay. Very, very quickly, I found something about on the Cambridge Apostles. Secret intellectual society founded at the University of Cambridge in 1820 by George Tomlinson, who later became the Bishop of Gibraltar, officially called the Cambridge Conversation Society, a small invitation-only club. I never get invited to any club, by the way. Escape key. Limited to undergraduates and a few senior members. Membership is lifelong, with the society operating quietly in the background. Meetings usually involve presenting and debating papers on philosophical, political, and cultural topics. Once an apostle, always an apostle. Alumni remain part of the network. Dude, I don't know about you, but I'm very wary of secret societies. So they've had G.E. Moore, Bertrand Russell, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Foster, John Maynard Keynes, Oppenheimer, and wow, even though he's American, yeah, he was because he was spent some time in Cambridge.
But what's interesting is basically a name which is not there. So the entire Balfour, gang, kind of his entire family was basically members of it, with one notable exception, except that basically in one of the books, kind of he is listed.
Balfour gang?
Balfour, the family, Balfour.
Balfour family, like Balfour Declaration.
Declaration, yes.
Okay, and who else?
Well, where I actually wanted to go with this was basically in 1930. Victor Rothschild had an MI6 file, right, which was published sort of declassified and published basically a number of years ago. And it includes, and this is MI6 themselves writing this, right, saying that in 1930 it happened just by coincidence that practically every single member of basically the Cambridge Apostles were scientific socialists, communists, basically, right? And Victor Rothschild had been a member at that point in time. Now, at that point in time, basically, he lived in a flat in London, and he was basically a bit of a hotspot of left-wing sort of activity. And two of the members kind of basically of Cambridge 5 were regulars in his flat. And yeah, the Cambridge 5 were Soviet spies.
Anthony Blunt, Guy Burgess,
Exactly.
Kim Philby, John Cairncross were later exposed as Soviet spies because Rothschilds had been friendly with them at Cambridge and also worked in intelligence.
He was a member of the Cambridge Apostles.
He was the fifth man.
I don't know if he was a fifth man, basically. I mean, no one's going to tell you that, kind of basically. But, I mean, I don't think he would be, because I don't think it's their way of doing business. I think kind of basically they like to keep their hands clean. I think they operate sort of two links out, so to speak.
These communist people, they love it, don't they? What they want is basically, it's a way of consolidating their power. Because the reality is, in the communist society, you've got this very small group of elite people who have all the power, all the money, all the resources, and everyone else has nothing. I mean, and it's funny because it seems like all the billionaires are Marxists as well. All of them are revolutionary Marxists, cultural Marxists. All the billionaires are cultural Marxists.
Well, I mean, look, kind of basically,
they want to conserve their money and wealth and make sure you have nothing.
I've spent a fair bit of time basically on Marxism. I've read a lot of basically about Marx and Lenin, and especially Bogdanov, who's incredibly intelligent. But anyway, fundamentally, so one of the key problems with communism is essentially, so you have the 10 planks where effectively, the state centralizes everything. That's fundamentally it. And of course, it includes kind of basically one central banking control of all credit. But this is supposed to be the sort of middle stage towards the final stage of communism, and communism basically will just sort of arrive when the state just naturally withers away. There's no explanation of essentially how this final stage will come to pass. It's just sort of like it will just sort of naturally happen. It'll just wither away.
So what will happen? What do they describe?
Well, this is the thing. Karl Marx and Engels, they spent a lot of space sitting discussing basically sort of hypothetical end state and basically what they sort of forget is to detail how you go from this, dictatorship of the proletariat and into the final stage of communism where the state withers away. It's just described sort of like, oh, it'll just sort of happen, kind of, it'll just sort of happen kind of basically when people, I guess, have been reformed or something along those lines. It's a wishy-washy, really, really wishy-washy explanation.
Who funded Marx and Engels?
Well, no, but again, kind of basically, that's a longer conversation.
No, seriously, but who was behind them? Who were funding them?
Well, basically, kind of, they're part of the League of the Just, basically, before. They're not part of it, but that was what came before. But I haven't really looked into that, but I can tell you essentially kind of where the ideology comes from, basically, and that comes from Moses Hess.
Moses Hess.
Yes.
I've heard that name.
Well, basically, kind of what Moses Hess was effectively saying, kind of basically was that we need to reform, reshape sort of society, kind of basically to be, basically about moral sort of objectives, kind of basically, social goods. And effectively, kind of basically, we need to restructure economics, basically, in order to get there, right? Now, Karl Marx and Engels, kind of basically, were both very close to Moses Hess. They later sort of fell out, basically, because essentially, kind of Hess was this sort of, he came up with these sort of concept, kind of basically, he had no sort of practical sort of sense of how to actually implement this. And this is where Karl Marx and Engels then came and produced kind of basically their sort of manifesto.
Moses Hess, 1812 to 1875. Oh, yeah, I have read about this guy. It was a German Jewish philosopher, early political thinker, played a pivotal role in socialist theory and modern Zionism, and he worked closely with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the 1940s. I mean, do you think a lot of this goes back to like Jewish Talmudism and like that this whole socialist idea? Is that where it all comes from?
What I personally think is essentially kind of the people basically who are doing this kind of are opportunists, and they will go through any material in order to exploit every angle they possibly can. I don't have a personal sort of issue based regards to any particular group. Kind of basically, I think they quite literally exploit everyone kind of basically through
I agree with
finding
that.
angles kind of basically essentially in the material.
But I agree with that. But I'm just saying, if you look at a lot of the people behind Marxism, and I think Marx's grandfather was a rabbi, and if you look at a lot of people in Bolshevism, they seem to be coming from that,
yeah, okay,
from
fair
the
enough.
Jewish
But
background. I'm trying to say, is there something in that faith that promotes this kind of? Someone said to me recently that even Israel is quite socialist. They've got the kibbutz. So it's a very communist type mindset that you're
going to have to speak to someone else based in that regard. I'm not an expert on that kind of basis, but I can say though kind of basis since there are plenty. I don't consider this basically an issue kind of based with a particular religion. I think kind of basically it's a bunch of deeply exploitative people who effectively kind of basically essentially exploit everyone and everything, right? And basically kind of when you effectively go through kind of all this material, you'll find people of every faith, of every skin color, whatever, right?
one group isn't more overly represented than any other group.
Well, possibly it is kind of basically, but that comes down to basically the individual kind of to make that assessment. I'm going to sit and make that call. Basically, I can tell you one thing, right? Kind of basically, I've dived through a lot of United Nations documents, and there have been so many names kind of basically haven't been able to pronounce from so many different languages. Kind of basically that. It's basically this spans the world. They're evil in all of us, kind of ultimately, sort of.
No, I know that. But I'm just trying to understand, like, where is this all coming from? Like, what the hell? It's just interesting.
Well, the thing is basically kind of ultimately from my perspective, kind of basically it all comes back to the central banks, regardless. As said, basically kind of when you look, as said. With regards to Marx, they didn't have an explanation of how you'd leave the sort of dictatorship of the proletariat. They established effectively basically a dictatorship, basically a workers' dictatorship, which was obviously never going to be a workers' dictatorship. And they say
workers dictatorship.
Workers' dictatorship. Yeah, and then basically say that, it's just naturally going to wither away. And then comes Lenin as the next person, and he basically sort of says, okay, fair enough, the way to sort of to get there is to introduce a vanguard state, which is effectively a police state and effectively through accounting and control.
What state?
A police state.
Because I heard vanguard something.
Yeah, vanguard state.
Vanguard state.
Vanguard state. It's sort of a small police force or whatever, whatever you want to call it. Enforcing kind of basically kind of whatever's being dictated from above,
All right, listen, we've got about 40 minutes left. All your reading, all your researching, I want you to just very succinctly map out where are we heading? What is the vision of these people? How are they achieving it? And what steps can we take to stop it from happening?
Well, I recently posted on my Substack and most recent sort of article called Quick Start Guide for the Navigator of Spaceship Earth. And it's sort of a facetious, satirical sort of perspective, kind of basically of a quick, a dummy's guide to, whoever steps into this spaceship Earth cockpit on his first day and sort of tries to make sense of all the dials. And it's effectively said a satirical sort of view upon kind of like how deeply dystopian kind of this is from our perspective, right? But I presented the sort of inside point basically behind it was basically I wanted to present it in an almost mocking way, kind of, because it is really dark, this matter, right? But by presenting
I'm just trying to find it. So carry on.
But by presenting it like kind of basically with sort of kids sort of Fisher Price manual sort of looking graphics, kind of basically kind of would sort of seem deliberately dumbed down, basically kind of to the extent that even someone deeply evil ultimately kind of basically could step in and understand it on his first day, right? And fundamentally, all this comes back to conditional finance. It's all guided by basically kind of the ability of stopping money flowing at any point in time. Because with that money, you cannot feed your kids. Basically, that's just the bottom line, right? And with conditional finance, you can effectively control individual behavior through CBDCs. You can control corporate behavior, kind of basically kind of not necessarily through CBDCs, but through, CSR, ESGs, and these will then impact kind of like, basically kind of your interest rate you pay basically on debt and that so forth, right?
I found that.
But it will also impact essentially kind of, conditional governance and conditional sovereignty, where essentially kind of, a sovereign state will not be able to do X, Y, Z without clearing kind of basically the conditional gates. And that's fundamentally it. Kind of basically you have someone sitting saying kind of you have to do a certain set of, you're clearing basically certain conditionality in order to basically be able to, commit to a certain transaction. Otherwise, kind of it's not going to go ahead. And by doing this at every scale in society, kind of they can effectively coerce everyone to step basically kind of in a certain direction. And now essentially you ask which values they are, and basically essentially the values which are pushed that way is effectively planetary stewardship. And
so no, I said, where are we heading?
Yeah. Well, I'll get to that. Basically, kind of, I just want to clear up essentially kind of how this works and how effectively it's enforced.
Right.
So basically, kind of you have essentially kind of one authority sitting dictating kind of basically what our sort of alleged goals are. And these goals will be presented exactly as they were during COVID. If you don't take the vaccine, then you're some sort of unethical human being, and no one should have any respect for you, yada, yada, all that sort of stuff, right? It's all sold as an ethical imperative. If you don't want to save planet Earth, then you're an evil human being, and essentially kind of, whatever comes your way, you deserve it, right? So everything will be sold through an ethical imperative. And you question what exactly will be sold by an ethical imperative. Well, it's very simple. We have surveillance everywhere in society today, right? We have live streaming satellites from outer space, which are basically kind of controlling who cuts down a tree anywhere on the planet, right? Now, effectively, kind of basically imagine, effectively, if you're a state and you live under conditional sovereignty, where essentially you will not receive money unless you live according to a certain set of rules. And someone in your country basically has been found to cut down trees, basically in the Amazonas, whatever, right? Now, effectively, kind of basically the sort of planetary navigator, right? The navigator of spaceship Earth, right? Can effectively sit and dictate kind of, to a certain nation. So say Brazil, for instance, you have some farmers basically who appear to be cutting down trees. Unless you stop that immediately, kind of basically you will not receive kind of the next tranche of funding. And basically what is Brazil to do? Kind of basically, of course, they will stop this, right? or Brazil is perhaps not the best example, but if you go to basically kind of poor, extremely poor nations, they don't really have any ability sort of to stand up to this, right? So effectively, everyone kind of basically is forced basically kind of through this conditionality. You have to clear the gate, otherwise you will not receive funding. And that basically, as I said, it's being sort of imposed for every single layer, every strata of society. So everyone basically kind of will be under, you have to live to your planetary sort of stewardship obligations. Otherwise, there will be no money. And then obviously kind of with CBDCs, kind of basically, if you don't clear that gate, kind of basically the 15-minute city kind of basically will not allow you to step outside your zone and so forth and so forth. You have to keep up with the vaccine shot. Otherwise, you're deeply unethical human being, yada, yada, yada. Basically, it ties in with everything else. So it's fundamentally, it's a global governance system of tomorrow, which is completely controlled through the unit of account, which is effectively kind of basically what Alfred Simmons said in 1926, right? And it's all about alleged social justice, basically environmental justice or economic justice, whatever. In other words, it's a common good. It's a social good. That's fundamentally the principle. Money will be used to control everyone, basically everyone's access. The individual, the corporates, the nation state, everyone has to toe the line. If they don't, there's no money, and you can't pay for whatever.
Well, why would you do this? Like, if you've got so much money, why can't they just fucking be happy and live in their mansions and go on lots of holidays? And what is it with this complete, total fucking control?
Well, if you read the 1968 UNESCO Biosphere conference proceedings, so 1968, there was this UNESCO conference, and it's basically the proceedings are just mind-blowing. It's one of those manuals, reports that go back to now and then, and pick up something else. I mean, they have planned this spectacularly well, right? they've slipped up a few times, they made some mistakes, but they have executed incredibly well.
What mistakes have they made?
Well, basically, certain things have been divulged, and some things have not come out, as they planned. But basically, they always have a plan B, it seems. But in general speaking, they have not had perfect execution, but it's been pretty damn close. There's also been some people attempting to leak. So, for instance, one of the one of the documents essentially that I've been commenting on quite a lot, essentially as of late, is silent weapon for quiet wars, which everyone will tell you is conspiracy theory, is definitely a hoax.
I've read it, and it's difficult for me to understand in the beginning. It's so complicated. It's mathematical equations. And, but it fucking reads like it makes sense.
Well, so this is the thing, right? So the document sort of speaks of 1954, which is when supposedly declared war on the people, right? That's the year of the first Bilderberg.
But who declared war?
Well, again, if I can just explain, one line, first, the point is essentially, if you investigate this document from the metadata, then your conclusion will be, it's a hoax, right? Because that's what everyone says, and everyone analyzes it from perspective of being, a hoax from on base of the metadata, right? But if you actually understand what the document is saying, the document is essentially saying that this is about producing a predictable sort of economy, right? Where effectively we have a given set of inputs, and we will get these outputs and these outcomes, yada yada. That is effectively PPBS, which was introduced in 1961 by McNamara.
PPS?
PPBS, planning, programming, budgeting system. It's a longer conversation itself, but fundamentally it's based upon input-output analysis, and input-output analysis traces back to Marx originally, right? But the point here is essentially, if you do a technical analysis of the actual document itself, it makes complete sense.
It did to me when I read it.
So in other words, if this is a hoax from a technical analysis perspective, it is a bloody good hoax, right? But
bloody good hoax, man.
The really what's really important from that document in particular is essentially they're speaking with economical equivalents, with capacitance, conductance, and
absolutely
resistance.
I read it in Bill Cooper's book, Pale Horse.
Yeah,
that was the best part of the book. The rest of the book I didn't like. I think it was actually very disappointing.
Well, but so the point essentially of the section regards to the capacitance, conductance, blah blah blah, right, is effectively when you start going through essentially how this sort of works, then fundamentally what it does is that it places financial sort of policy financial policy essentially so you got monetary and you got financial sort of policy. Sorry, my brain is slipping here a little bit.
Take your time. Don't worry.
The point is, it's sell side. It's a document which ultimately sells the idea of Keynesianism to basically the participants at the Bilderberg conference. That's my reading of it. However, what the document does not say that is essentially given that we all live under not communism, basically Keynesianism at this point in time. In order to run counter-cyclical sort of fiscal policy, you require the backing of the central banks. And as said, central banks will ensure, no one will ever pay off since the deficits during the good times get real. People will just find a reason to sort of run the economy neutral and consequently over the long term keep building up debts. But basically fundamentally silent weapons for Quiet Wars basically presents essentially a sell side of Keynesian economics, which effectively benefits the central banks. That's ultimately kind of who it benefits. And just by sheer coincidence, both Rockefeller and Rothschild basically kind of named basically in that document. It's just yet another coincidence, it's just basically by a set. If this is a hoax, then it's an immaculate hoax, because basically kind of, it's set. It connects straight up kind of basically with input and output analysis, and effectively kind of basically what the function described is PBBS. And essentially kind of when you look at all the details with regards to Leontief and the Harvard studies, all that sort of stuff kind of can be found kind of in the Rockefeller annual reports. Everything aligns.
But when I read that document, what struck me was, actually, I hate to say this, how beautiful it was. It was so precise and so intelligent, and it reads people so well, and the way it translated the economics into practical, like worldwide situation. And it was scary to me, because they kind of know how human beings work, and they know how they can manipulate us. And they knew this back in the 60s and 70s.
Oh, they knew before. Rockefeller Foundation spent a lot of money kind of basically on social sciences already from the 1920s.
Like, they've known, and they've deliberately withheld knowledge from us so that we've remained in the dark. Basically, they have the full picture and we only have the small picture.
Yeah.
So we will never be on a level playing field with them, because we never know all the facts. We don't know all the information.
No, basically, but the point ultimately to sort of I forget the thread, kind of where were we originally, kind of we were talking about
Quiet wars, silent weapons.
Yeah, silent weapons, kind of. I mean, essentially, the document also ties up basically kind of with the report from Iron Mountain, basically kind of, which John Kenneth Galbraith kind of basically was part of it, and he was initially very insistent that this was not a joke, kind of, that this was real. Now, the thing is, what that document, basically, the report from Iron Mountain, basically effectively said, it came up with a bunch of sort of solutions, basically, regards to how they could produce basically kind of these sort of outcomes, which were pretty much aligned, kind of basically with silent weapons. However, kind of one of the ones they were zooming in on was basically kind of environmentalism. However, they were talking about deliberately basically polluting kind of basically environment in order to get there. Now, and this is really interesting because this is around 1964, which is basically kind of, right after Kennedy has been assassinated, and Khrushchev kind of basically is being deposed, effectively, kind of basically by Brezhnev and Kosygin in 1964, kind of basically and David Rockefeller at that point in time basically took a trip kind of basically to Moscow. And if you read the official sort of like lines these days, who's talking about trade, it's like, okay, so this is 2 years after kind of basically the world nearly came to nuclear blows, basically in Cuba, and here you are allegedly talking about trade. Yeah, okay. There must have been something else basically kind of on that, in that discussion, kind of, because basically kind of what exactly sort of caused, Khrushchev to be deposed basically just a few months later. Is it entirely possible that kind of, in order to kind of basically converge the East and the West, they had to fabricate kind of basically into the sort of climate alarmism? And who knows, basically Khrushchev kind of basically might not actually have trusted kind of basically, the West because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but he was a notoriously sort of unstable character. But what happened next was essentially in 1966 was Lyndon B. Johnson basically was talking about basically East and the West should cooperate basically kind of in scientific matters, right? Kind of basically, it's all very strange. It's on the IIASA's website, basically, for those who sort of question that, basically kind of against.
What's IIA stand for?
The International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. It's effectively the world's premier sort of global modeler. So basically, you have the IPCC, and they come with the sort of weather forecast that we're all going to die in a lake of fire in 50 years if we don't do whatever. The sort of IIASA basically are all over that. Well, anyway, 1972 basically is actually a really interesting year in that regard, because in 1972, actually no, before that, 1969, there was a Moynihan memo kind of from September 17, 1969, kind of, and the media about a year ago kind of basically was declassified about a year ago. The mainstream media, as dumb as it is, basically kind of was talking about, oh no, they're known about climate change, basically kind of in 1969. What the document actually says is essentially kind of, the typical sort of ludicrous predictions that New York will be underwater and blah, 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 right? And then in the very next paragraph, it says it's entirely possible, basically, there will be sort of countervailing sort of forces, and consequently, we don't really know. But either way, it's probably kind of basically a thing which would be picked up by NATO to run global surveillance kind of basically on the environment, which is kind of like, one of those sort of things. Once you've read that, it's like, NATO should run global surveillance on the environment. I mean, seriously, and no one's picked up on this. And then in 1969, basically ICSU, they started this scope. It was called Scientific Committee on Problems of the Environment. And they wrote 2 reports. Basically, the first report was Scope 1, which was basically requested by Maurice Strong as an input for the 1972 UNEP meeting in Stockholm. And the second one, and it was about global environment monitoring, right? And then basically, essentially this passes, essentially they agree on this, right? In 1973, they write the follow-up report, which is effectively an implementation guide for this system. And this system, basically with global monitoring gems, UNEP gems, right, is incredibly detailed, basically, and even includes like socio-economic factors and public health surveillance. And when they floated this system in 1974, UNEP gems in 1974, some of the less developed nations, they were basically sitting in meetings sort of saying, this is not what we agreed to, basically starting to ask really targeted questions because they clearly sort of smelled something's not quite right about this. But their concerns obviously are just sort of drowned out and they don't take any more questions, blah, blah. But basically UNEP GEMS essentially came to be, basically, which is all about global surveillance, effectively, right?
UNEP GEMS.
UNEP, so United Nations Environment Program, UNEP GEMS. But anyway, so if we go back to 1972 was really pivotal year because we got the limits to growth.
Yeah.
But we also got basically essentially the Stockholm meet, and we also have the IIASA, which is the world's global sort of modeler, right? Which basically does climate forecasts and all that sort of stuff, right? On basis of surveillance information, which is always incomplete. You see, the thing is, every single time they mispredict something, they'll just go out and sort of say it's because we didn't have enough surveillance information. So even in a situation where they mispredict, they have weaponized that in order to use it as an excuse to build even more surveillance capacity. So anyway, going back to 1972, basically, because there was basically SALT agreements basically between Soviet Union and the United States at that point in time, where strategic sort of nuclear negotiations, I forget what it stands for, but it was about limiting nuclear weapons, right? And that's all the headlines. And you also have the UNEP meet in Stockholm, right? However, just before the SALT negotiations, they signed, United States and Soviet Union signed an agreement called Cooperation on Environmental Protection. And what that document basically says is essentially the 2 superpowers should cooperate in order to write a common policy for the two basic nations. Which is just like absolutely astonishing. You're sitting reading this document, and no one's paid any attention to it, but it's real. But what is really incredible about this document is essentially the person who negotiated this through was Russell, who at the very same point in time was also basically the head of the part of NATO, which was focusing on global surveillance. So you're telling me here, that the Soviet Union signed an agreement negotiated by the person who is responsible for NATO's global surveillance project. That makes no sense whatsoever, unless the Soviet Union at that point in time were in on it.
I think it's obvious they were in on it. I want to just go back to silent weapons.
Can I just say one thing here, right? This is really important. I'm sorry. In 1987, this is another of those documents which no one even reads, right? Basically, Gorbachev delivered a speech in November 1987, where he said basically the apparent threat of the Soviet Union must sort of seem to dissipate, as in disappear, and instead a global focus on the environment should replace it. It's just, essentially read that speech, it just gives it all away. And it's just, it doesn't get any traction basically online. It's just astonishing to me.
Really?
Yeah, it's called, hang on, come to see, To Feel Responsible for the World's Destiny. That's basically it's covered on Substack, but one of the 3 speeches basically got covered.
What was that speech called again?
To Feel Responsible for the World's Destiny. But he's literally giving it away.
Where did he write that?
Well, he delivered the speech basically at a Soviet sort of Congress in November 1987. And he's saying basically the Soviet Union must be seen to disappear so the entire world can focus on a common sort of focus on the environment.
Common human challenges. Yeah, he wanted to retreat the Soviet Union from its Cold War posture with a new global mission, mentalism as humanity's shared destiny.
If you then go back to basically kind of, 1960s, basically.
Oh, here we go. In 1993, he said, we must foster a new sense of global interdependence and universal responsibility. We are responsible for the destiny of our common home.
Yes. Now, in the 1960s, basically, we had Anatoly Golitsyn, basically, who wrote a book called The Perestroika Deception. He was basically he was a spy or something along those lines, and he identified Victor Rothschild as one of the spies. Anyway, so Golitsyn, he sort of leaves.
So in his 1987 book, Perestroika, Gorbachev wrote that humanity had entered a stage where survival depended on cooperation to prevent ecological catastrophe. He sounds like a fucking globalist.
Oh, God, yeah. And in 1993, he co-founded kind of basically what's called the Green... Oh, God, what's it called?
Okay, can I talk about something else then? I really want to talk about silent weapons for quiet wars because, I'm asking you, where's everything going and how's it going there? I think this is what's key. All right, because I made some notes about this because I read Bill Cooper's book, A Pale Horse, and it's in the beginning of that. And it's about this, surplus IBM photocopier. Yeah, we'll come to that in a second. Photocopier. And it's purchased at a sale. Inside the photocopier is this document and it's been circulated. And a lot of people say it's complete fiction. But man, if it's fiction, it's an incredible piece of fiction. So basically, what it outlines is a supposed plan for this quiet war on humanity, on the general population. And it's fundamentally traitorous because if you're an American and you're enacting this on your population, you're waging war on your own people. It's traitorous, treasonous, whatever. And they do the war, the quiet warfare isn't with ballistic missiles and weapons. It's economic, psychological, technological tools instead of open military conflict. And the main themes are they're going to control people through economics, like you said, debt, taxation, and inflation to enslave the populations. Then they do social engineering through education, media, and entertainment. And that's to distract you, pacify you, and program you. And then there's going to be technological surveillance with computers, data collections. And so you're managing society quietly, and everything's gradualism. So it's like it's not like a hot war. It's that slowly boiling you in the frog kind of thing. It's a subtle, long-term, and often invisible to its target. So the population, us, aren't even aware that it's happening to us. We're slowly being boiled alive, and we don't even know about it. That's why it's quiet. It's subversive. So it's about a total control of society by a small so-called elite group of people, while the masses are totally oblivious and ignorant to the fact that they're under attack. They are under war. And this is why I say we're already undergoing World War III. So you have this docile, compliant population who are drugged up with drugs, alcohol, SSRIs, you name it, dumbed down with vaccines, toxins, whose energy and productivity are harvested through economic manipulation. You've got self-policing behavior. We accept our own servitude because that control mechanism feels normal. Like we police ourselves, and you eliminate resistance by keeping people distracted with consumerism and entertainment and keeping them economically dependent. It's fucking evil, isn't it?
No, it is. I'm not really going to disagree with that.
Is there anything further that I missed? Do you think there is a plan for depopulation as well?
Well, that's effectively what I allude to in my most recent Substack. Yeah, that, I describe excessive sort of humans as an optimization problem.
Sorry, say that again slowly.
I describe sort of a surplus of humans as an optimization problem.
I know you don't drink fizzy water, but here's some fizzy water.
All right, thank you.
There's a surplus of human.
Yeah, the reason why I wanted to bring 1968 UNESCO Biosphere Conference into this was because basically, if it's an incredible document and it's got 20 recommendations, of which recommendation 3 basically says, recommendation 3.2 says essentially the ecosystem disturbance as a result of human invading ecosystems, or basically cutting down trees, etc. Right? Kind of basically is the result, the outcome. I forget the exact terminology. Kind of basically, but it says basically zoonotic diseases will arise from this. Zoonotic diseases will arise from this. Yes, and in 3.3, it says basically kind of that that humanity is out of balance with nature. And it needs to be, corrected, so to speak. And that's fundamentally a message which has been broadcast continuously through One Health, that humanity is, out of balance with nature. And the way fundamentally the way they judge this is basically if you consider this as sustainable development goals, they broadly break into three different strategies, components, right? Basically you have the natural resource base, like the oceans and land and so forth, right? Then you have the ecosystem services, which are effectively how we rely on nature itself, gets the sort of medium between humanity, basically nature itself. And then you have the human well-being. And it just by sheer coincidence, I'm sure, basically the UNEP GEO 6 report outlines basically sort of a long-term vision for 2050, where they have essentially a figure showing exactly this, that it's basically you have human sort of well-being, you have the natural resource base, and then in the middle, basically you have the ecosystem services, right? Basically where you have the production from the natural resource base, and you have the consumption from the human well-being. And fundamentally, what this is about is basically making sure those two basically are in balance. Because right now the argument is it's massively out of balance. So in other words, in order to balance that, either we almost have really shitty lives, pardon my French, or there should just be far fewer of us. So
that's back to Dennis Meadows.
Yes.
Limits to growth.
Absolutely.
You either have freedom and democracy, but have to accept very poor quality of life and be poor and hungry, or you have a very high quality life, but you live under this technocratic dictatorship and there's less of you.
Yeah, his former wife, basically, she passed away. Donella Meadows basically wrote some really interesting books as well, basically one of which was the Leverage Points, it's called. And it basically describes how to sort of change society, where effectively everything is broken down into, how you can sort of shift societies, basically what sort of strategies you can use in order to massively shift societies, where it sort of says changing tax rate doesn't really change anything because people fundamentally just to readjust around it. But ultimately at the very top, basically they're talking about paradigm shifts, about basically how, sort of you must fundamentally sort of come to believe in something else, basically can shift you basically in a different direction. And basically, actually, it's not technically speaking the paradigm shift, it's a meta paradigm shift, basically at the very sort of top, where effectively they can just shift between any number of, meta crisis, effectively.
Meta crisis, yeah. They will manufacture global crises, pestilence, disease, financial wars, enact their global change and global policies. Right, listen, so we've ascertained, I think, roughly where they're heading. Right, one world government, depopulation, total fucking control. Basically, an upgraded, more advanced version of communism. Communal, fascism, whatever you want to call it, public-private partnership. I mean, at the end of the day, the fascists and the communists, I think they're very much the same. They're using the rich elite, use the state to have complete control over the masses.
I think it's another of those arguments where
it doesn't matter.
Exactly. It's a total waste of time, basically, to have a conversation. But technically speaking, since they're internationalist, they must be communist. Because fascists basically have got a strong sort of national element.
Exactly.
Ergo, basically, since by definition, they must be communist. But,
when I say communism 2.0, I don't mean the original communism back. That's the whole point. It's version 2.0. It's an upgraded, more sophisticated control grid mechanism. They learned their lessons with communism 1.0. They're enacting communism 2.0. And so...
can I just say one thing here, basically, because this is really important. Basically, one of the, because it affects what we're doing right now, basically, and you're asking in regards to where we're going, basically, in regards to this and how to stop it. One of the things they're doing right now, or two things they're doing right now, basically, the first thing is basically the pathogen access and benefit sharing. Once that's come through, then when you couple that with the pandemic treaty, you effectively have a health equity clearinghouse, where those people who are sitting distributing basically who should receive health equity.
Well, again, pandemic. What? Sorry, the first thing you said.
Pathogen access and benefit sharing. It draws on a Convention on Biological Diversity, ABS framework. Basically, fundamentally, it's about distributing equity, basically, which you will only receive sort of as a pellet, basically, if you're in a Skinner box, planetary Skinner boxes. Yeah, basically, can you couple that with a pandemic treaty and you've got basically a health equity clearinghouse? But the more important one, basically, right now is because they're negotiating right now, basically, is essentially the United Nations Emergency Platform. The United Nations Emergency Platform effectively basically will create a global state where essentially a black box, basically IIASA will do some sort of modeling which will predict 10 trillion deaths in Norway tomorrow. And consequently, we will need to lock down every single nation or blah, 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 right? Now, what they're working on right now is stripping veto right. They're also working on including ecocide. as part of the what do you call basically the Security Council's reasons to effectively kind of get actively engaged, right? Now, this is important because the Security Council is the only agency of United Nations which has got a right kind of basically to prescribe the use of force. So in other words, the trajectory we're on right now, right, is effectively one where basically black box kind of basically will predict some complete fucking bullshit, which neither you or I can challenge basically in any realistic way. This will be shifted off kind of basically to the Security General kind of basically, which is Antonio Guterres, who's a member of Collegium International, but we'll let that slide. And he will declare a global emergency, lock everyone down in their houses, and basically use it to push all these authoritarian measures like we're discussing basically with regards to Ukraine. And when that happens, any nation which disagrees, the Security Council will say that they're basically failing to protect their native populations under, I don't know, kind of basically responsibility to protect kind of basically protocols kind of, and consequently invade your country for not locking down.
Like they did to Libya. Gaddafi wasn't protecting his citizens. And like the way any dissident, prime minister or president in Africa got fucking assassinated. The Tanzanian one, remember during COVID? He disappeared. I mean, how many? They all just fucking died of heart attacks, disappeared, whatever.
Strangely, all the ones which disagreed with the measures.
Yeah. Any leader that disagreed with the measures suddenly just found themselves disappeared.
Yeah, but but the point here basically is essential. So you got a black box model that you cannot challenge, right? Which will predict whatever bullshit. That will be sent off to the UN Security Secretary General, who will lock down the entire world. And there's nothing you can do democratically to challenge this. That will force this through the UN Security Council kind of to invade any country basically which opposes this. And the ECOSOC is essentially kind of the organization which organizes the ECOSOC, basically. It's the
Eco-security.
No, Economic and Social Council. Basically, it's social and economics, again, like Alfred Simon basically was talking about. They effectively basically the organization, the administrative organ basically of the United Nations, who will draw in the public-private partnerships. And that's basically kind of where you spoke about the Trilateral Commission earlier. Basically, the Trilateral Commission is effectively kind of basically a meeting club, so to speak, for basically the public, private, and NGO basically partners to meet and discuss behind closed doors, obviously. Then you have essentially the World Economic Forum, which is effectively kind of since primarily kind of is the private enterprise, and therein is the interest group, so to speak, kind of, if you see what I mean. But it all sort of neatly aligns basically with one another, kind of. There's method behind the madness.
Okay. Dude, getting a headache. There's basically devious motherfuckers who've created a web of think tanks, institutions that have indoctrinated and brainwashed the academic institutions, the professors, the teachers, made the masses dumb down and stupid, wrapped us up in red tape and bureaucracy, lied to us. Everything is an inversion. Whatever they say to you, they mean something completely different. And they're kept us in the dark, so we have no fucking idea what's going on. But basically, it's all about them getting more power, more money, more control, and us being cattle to be herded, farmed, and slaughtered. What the fuck can we do about it?
In 1949, UNESCO kind of basically were discussing how to enable this. And they wrote kind of basically into this sort of manual, kind of basically into the United Nations and the world citizenship. This is from 1949. This is not a joke, right? Do you know what the initial recommendations were? To brainwash the teachers, because the teachers would effectively get to the kids kind of basically, and then progressively they could introduce basically this, right?
Okay. So how do we break through? How do we we've clarified the problem and like there's so much more details we could go into, but what can we do? Me, you, the listeners, the readers, to stop this? The
first thing is awareness, basically, because all this is hidden behind so many complex webs, basically of Aesopian phrasing and
Aesopian.
Yeah, Aesopian.
How'd you spell that? I've never heard that word before.
Aesopian.
Aesopian phrasing. Okay, I can't find it. How'd you spell it again?
Aesopi.
Aesopian language is a form of concealed communication where an innocent or literal meaning is presented to outsiders while a hidden, often subversive or critical meaning is conveyed to an intended audience. Named after the ancient Greek fabulist Aesop, this technique uses figurative language like allegory, symbolism, and allusion to bypass censorship and critique authority in environments where direct expression is dangerous. Dual meaning, so it's got characteristics, dual meaning. The core feature is its ability to maintain two simultaneous meanings, one for the censor and one for the aware reader. Well, that's fucking not great. So basically, they say one thing to us when they actually mean another thing to us.
Yeah.
Okay, I never heard that before. Thank you for educating me on that.
Oh,
Okay,
sorry.
carry on.
Well, fundamentally, the first thing is visibility. There's a reason kind of basically why they've done all this basically kind of in the middle of the night, basically.
So you want to put visibility. You want to shine the light on it.
Yes, people need to understand what it is they're actually up to, as opposed to what they say. That when they say United Nations, emergency platform and complex global challenges, what they're actually talking about basically is a black box, which is basically whatever bullshit has been programmed to predict.
Bullshit in, bullshit out.
Exactly.
Garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah, but the point is essentially every single time one of these black boxes predicts something, you can't hold anyone accountable. No one is there to be held accountable. The politicians only did what they were instructed to, yeah? And essentially kind of the people who funded it, kind of basically they were doing it in good faith. And the people who are sitting modeling, I was going to say, it's like, well, the problem is that we fundamentally don't have enough global surveillance, and then use it as an excuse to build even more surveillance infrastructure.
This is very important what you just said. Slow down a bit. So everyone says, I'm just following orders.
Yep.
I'm just doing as I'm told. I don't know anything. Because I think one of the key problems that we face in the world today is lack of accountability.
Yes.
You and I are accountable. We're fucking accountable. When we drive 1 mile over the speed limit, we get a fucking ticket for it. But everyone else, there's no accountability. Bill Gates, no fucking accountability. Biden, no accountability. Trump, no accountability. Keir Starmer, Rishi Sunak, Boris Johnson, Whitty, no fucking accountability. They can poison, enslave, lock us down, ruin our lives, ruin the businesses. Tony Blair, genociding, killing people. No accountability. What the fuck?
No, but so you've been remarkably restrained up until this point. But yeah, it's a bit as if you're about to explode.
I mean, we need to be passionate about this.
I'm not saying basically kind of I would say analytical kind of basically, but there has to be someone sitting kind of going through all this sort of stuff kind of basically, and for some reason kind of basically I ended up doing some of that work kind of bit. But regardless, the point is just essentially all this stuff needs to be visible for people to understand what's actually happening. So when they're pushing through all these plans in Gaza, as I said right now, and where they're sort of sitting telling everyone kind of basically kind of, oh, we need full transparency and accountability. What they're really talking about is essentially kind of introducing digital ID, audits, and all the other stuff we spoke about earlier. It's kind of like, as said, kind of basically they have special terminology for all this sort of stuff, Asobian phrasing, as said, where every single time they will tell you about basically kind of, good governance. What they're actually sort of saying is essentially kind of good governance, anyone of ethical leadership is someone who basically adheres to the ethical imperative, and the ethical imperative is essentially whatever the black box model sort of told us we have to do, otherwise the world is destroyed tomorrow. Basically, it's all bullshit, kind of basically. But the problem is fundamentally people don't really understand. But when you sit and read these...
No, but some people do understand.
No, but the point is essentially if you're confronted with an article sort of saying kind of basically we need full accountability and stuff like that, you think that sounds good. Of course it sounds good, because basically that's what your Chatham House and Council on Foreign Relations have spent many hours sitting determining what language to use.
Oh, I can pull this 100%. I'm going to be writing a Substack post on the Tony Blair Institute on Digital ID. And I'm just going to read an article. Citizens are rightly expecting the government to deliver common sense solutions or make a way. Hold on one second. So they're framing it in such a way. Of course you want common sense solutions. Who doesn't want common sense solutions? But what do you mean citizens are rightly expecting the government to deliver common... Well, maybe I don't want the government to make solutions for me. Maybe I'll come up with the solutions myself. They framed the language, so it's very difficult to argue with it. And if you argue with it, you come across as unreasonable. Does that make sense?
Yes.
The language they use in their documents is funneling you in and straitjacketing you and making you agree in principle with what they're saying. And it's very difficult for you to counter it and argue with it. Like, maybe I don't agree with this.
No, that's what I mean by the ethical imperative. They produce whatever it is they want to do. They frame it as you having to do this, otherwise you're unethical.
Yeah, you're a bad person.
Exactly.
Yeah, you don't want to get jabbed? What, are you a granny killer?
Exactly. Kind of basically,
don't you care about people? You're not wearing a mask? What, you want to
vaccinate your patients, kind of you're a bad person, you must be stripped of your license. You run afoul basically of the ethical declaration.
What I'm trying to say is they've done a great job of making society, the psychopaths have done a great job of making society psychopathic. So for example, when I questioned the vaccines and said, look, I'm getting all this harm, 2 medical directors, James something and Kathy Kale, 2 separate medical hospitals, Circle Group and Spire, sent me a letter, almost identical, on the same day, one day after my tweet, saying, take down your post, don't talk about this ever again, blah, 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 blah. And I said, hold on. And, this might lead to further disciplinary action and your practicing privileges might be revoked, blah, blah. And I wrote to both of them saying, hold on one second. I'm a doctor, consultant surgeon. I'm seeing something. Surely you should be asking me, what is it that I'm seeing that I'm concerned about? And you can investigate it. And it's better that you do that and then say, no, don't worry. We've looked into it. There's nothing for you to worry about. Then you just simply say to me, no, we're not going to look into this. Be quiet. Don't talk about this again, or you're going to get into trouble. How can you square that? They didn't reply. They would send then letters for investigations, meetings. I would say, no, what do you want to talk about? Tell me what I've done wrong. Wouldn't reply. And it went on like that. And eventually, I did a post on saying, like on the trans issue. And again, the head medical officer, Dr. K, says, writes to me, I am referring my concerns about you to the General Medical Council. And then from there, I never got a letter. The letter that she sent to the GMC, I never got a copy of that. I never saw the referral. But what I'm trying to say is she's a human being. She's a doctor. She could have sat back and said, I was not done anything. Why don't I speak to him and find out what's wrong and explain to him the issues that we've got and the problems we've got and the challenges that this is going to cause our institution and the ESG, DEI, and the fact ultimately our company is going to be penalized financially and having to... No, it was always behind a faceless person. There was no accountability. I never could draw anything out of them. And eventually they fucking just suspended me and kicked me out, What the fuck? But these are human beings. Have they got no soul? They're not evil Rothschilds or whatever. They're like just fucking other doctors. Did they not think for a second, hold on a second, this guy's got freedom of speech. He's just doing nothing wrong. He's being an ethical doctor. He's seeing some harm. We should look into it. No. Like, where is their humanity? I think human beings have become willing agents and servants to the evil people.
Yeah,
we're like, like the Borg Queen. I don't know if you ever watched Star Trek. What I'm trying to say is there are lots of little Borgs now doing the bidding of the Borg Queen.
Yeah, but just to address basically what you're saying before, what you effectively did, basically you ran afoul of your ethical obligation. And the people who dismissed you kind of basically was an ethics panel, kind of basically, which is essentially a clearinghouse structure, kind of basically which traces back, kind of basically in terms of you have a small structure which is sitting dictating kind of basically their rules upon everyone.
By the way, just in case everybody's wondering, I'm not shaking up and down. It's just my guest here has been bouncing in his chair for the last 2 hours, which is why the camera's moving up and down. So it looks like I'm moving up and down, but I'm not. It doesn't matter. Escape. So yeah, that is what happened to me. So it is what it is.
One of the things I always found really interesting in regards to the early days of the sort of alleged pandemic was, if you remember, sort of Denmark and Norway were very quick off the mark to sort of say there's something not quite right about AstraZeneca. And do you remember the response out of the UK?
No.
They basically on the same day said, oh, that's not true. And it always sort of stood out to me, right? Because I've worked in corporate environments and, within a few hours, nothing gets done, basically. Kind of, sort of information like that would have to basically escalate all the way down, all the way up again. Kind of, they would need to have meetings at every single level. Kind of, we need to have meetings in order to find out, kind of, is there a problem? But not here. Within a few hours, they're just like, no, that's not an issue. Which to me just sort of stood out like this is,
right.
This is total bollocks, basically.
It is total bollocks. All right, listen, final question of the day. You're on your deathbed. You're surrounded by your loved ones. You're about to meet your maker. Before you die and pass on, what words of wisdom and advice are you going to give everybody?
Oh my God, I have no idea. I wish I knew. Yeah, that collectivism never led anywhere good. I don't know. It's a really broad question.
You're dying slowly. Don't worry.
That might be kind of. What would you say?
It depends on every day. I think about it all the time. I would say don't be scared. Don't live in fear. Don't be in fear of other people. Realize the true strength that lives within you, that there's a divine spark within you, that God resides within you. You're a reflection of God. You're not some timid, weak, pathetic creature that they want you to think you are. You're stronger than you realize. You're magnificent. And even while they make you suffer and torture you, never forget who you are. You're a lion.
Well, that's very good. Very good.
That's off the cuff. That's what I think today. But if you ask me tomorrow, it'll be a different answer. I feel like I've only scratched the surface. I feel like man, your brain is like a dynamo. I need to slow it down. I think everyone listening to the podcast, listen, folks, listen at 0.75 speed so that you keep everything on board. But yeah, any last things, mate? Have we missed anything?
No, I mean, I would just say basically keep your eyes out on Gaza, because what they're doing is basically the Ukraine plan. And what they're doing effectively basically in Ukraine is they're bringing through the global sort of governance basically of tomorrow. Is the pilot side. And yeah. And essentially if that all comes through, then you will basically be living a conditional existence.
Do you think there's anywhere in the world that's safe to go to? Or?
No, I don't. I think fundamentally, even if you move to some nation which wouldn't sort of emphasize any of this early on, they would just be cut off from the international trading system, basically, and be forced in line almost immediately. So I don't fundamentally think there's anywhere to hide.
Do you think we are already seeing a one world government and it's just not come out of the shadows yet?
It's there. Basically, it's there, but it's very weak right now. And that's the reason why right now it's really important, kind of basically this information sort of in general, kind of basically these topics kind of basically are discussed, because as it is right now, they have not yet had time to condition the masses to accepting this. A lot of people might sort of accept, sort of, I don't know, kind of living under some state of emergency for a period of time, basically kind of about who's going to accept it when it's all the time. And that's fundamentally kind of what they're opting for. Because basically the Mayday crisis will effectively lead to a situation kind of where, there will always be some disaster, some emergency, basically, and consequently, they will have a reason to strip you of all your rights. It'll be basically COVID, except accelerated for multiple reasons. So it's kind of like, you looked at COVID and what was COVID really about? Like, well, one way to look at COVID was effectively, it was the first time where governance by indicators was essentially brought in, because I remember being in Denmark and standing on a beach, and we were essentially talking about basically if we crossed 80, the threshold was 80 cases per 100,000, they would close the borders basically, and we would have to jump in the car and drive off. And it's basically there was no discussion about this. It was all about like indicators and surveillance data. If you had 80 cases per 100,000, you locked down.
80 cases per 100,000, yeah.
Yeah, something along those lines, right? And 150 cases per 100,000 kind of base, then you issued quarantines and school closures.
It was shit. It was all bullshit.
Yeah, but the point is essentially this is government by a computer effectively, because it was not democratic. No one had this democratic deliberation. No one talked about basically whether to lock down at 80. It was all basically said by expert communities.
I've got a scary feeling that they're going to go ahead, and the question is, and be successful. The question is, are we able to limit the extent and duration of this dystopian nightmare?
I think we are. I think fundamentally, when you look closely at what they're doing right now, they're definitely accelerating the plans. Basically, kind of there are a lot of initiatives which are floated, which are not. It just feels a bit disconnected because they haven't really
thought it through.
Well, not so much thought it through, but they haven't really conditioned the masses basically to it. Like French digital ID right now, yeah.
Do you think they're scared that we're waking up and
Yes.
they're like, oh shit, we need to fucking lock down before it's too late?
Yes, I think fundamentally the situation they're in right now is essentially if they accelerate it too much, that in itself basically will sort of accelerate people waking up, and then it will come to nothing. Or if they don't do it fast enough, then people will naturally wake up as well. It's fundamentally that sort of situation where they're kind of stuck basically, and that's when you start. I don't think COVID was supposed to end basically with Omicron. I think that was a mistake. French basically spoke about which mistakes there were. But basically it's interesting because there were a couple of initiatives. I forget exactly what they're called. Climate 3D or something, I think was one of them. And it came to a very, very quick end, some of these initiatives, for no apparent reason, basically, until you realize that what probably took place in those senior meetings was essentially, oh shit, this narrative falling apart, right? Well, we got to start transitioning onto the climate fear-mongering.
Right, listen, I need to go, otherwise I'm going to be late for my kids at school.
Yeah, no worries.
It would have been, I could have easily spoken to you much longer. This is 2 hours and 23 minutes. The reality is, you missed your train, which is sad, and you had to take public transport because your car issues. And I'm very grateful that you came out here and did this in person. I really appreciate it. Honestly, mate. Very sobering conversation, but people do need to know. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me, of course. And it really is high time that basically we collectively start waking up and realizing exactly what it is they're doing. Because a lot of the things basically don't make any sense, and it's basically kind of what I wish is that people would start speaking up basically when they think things are not making sense. Because during COVID, I didn't think people basically were really questioning anything at all. They were just scared.
I, Ahmed Malik, am a private civilian protected by the Geneva Convention. My Substack, social media posts, and podcasts are my personal experiences, observations, and opinions. This information is for educational purposes only. Although I am a doctor, I am not your doctor, and I am not providing medical or legal advice to you or to the wider public. I am not licensed or registered with the GMC or any other licensing board. The responsibility for the interpretation, due diligence, and use of the information from my Substack and my podcast lies with you, the viewer and or listener. Please do your research and use your discernment. It is not my intention to harass, intimidate, offend, defame, conspire, blackmail, coerce, or cause anxiety, alarm, or distress to any man or woman, and the information presented here is done so with peaceful and honourable intentions. Enjoy, folks.